I still remember the way the forest swallowed the trail that morning. The sun was just beginning to leak through the tall pines, scattering gold across the dirt path, and I could hear the faint crunch of my boots against the fallen needles. It should have felt peaceful. It should have felt normal. But even as I stepped lightly, there was this wrongness in the air, like the trees themselves were holding their breath, waiting. I'd been told about Hollow Creek before I ever set foot on the trail. Hikers disappearing, campers never returning, strange footprints vanishing into thin soil. At the time, I laughed it off. People exaggerate. Small towns cling to legends. But legends, I've learned, often have a foundation in fear you can feel in your bones. That morning, I felt it creeping through mine. The hiker's name was Michael. Not someone I knew well, just someone I'd seen in passing at the trailhead. Friendly smile, worn green jacket, pack hanging low on his shoulders. He was experienced, the kind who laughed when people warned him about Hollow Creek. "It's just woods," he said, "nothing to worry about." I remember him taking the lead. I was behind him, listening to the birds sing in sporadic bursts, the distant creak of branches as wind shifted through the canopy. At first, everything seemed normal, too normal, the kind of normal that makes you glance over your shoulder even when nothing's there. By the time we reached a bend where the trail narrowed, the air had changed. Thicker, heavier. The smell of damp earth and decaying leaves pressed against my nose. Michael paused, one hand brushing against the trunk of an old oak, eyes narrowing at something I couldn't see. "You hear that?" he asked. His voice was casual, but there was tension in it, like the first hint of a storm before the sky darkens. I stopped straining, just wind. I told myself just wind, but there was a second layer, faint and rhythmic, like whispers carried on the breeze. I shook my head. Probably squirrels, probably nothing. But Michael didn't move. He tilted his head, listening. And then he turned to me with that same half smile, half frown. "I'm going to check something over there," he said, nodding toward a narrow trail veering into the dense undergrowth. "Don't follow." I watched him go. Every instinct screamed for me to call out, to ask him not to go alone. But curiosity and an unspoken trust kept me rooted to the trail. The whispers grew louder as he stepped away, almost forming words that my mind tried and failed to understand. I shook it off and waited, thinking he'd return quickly. Minutes passed, 10, 15. The birds went silent. The forest seemed to inhale around me, the air thickening with a quiet I could almost taste. Something scraped across the leaves nearby, soft, deliberate, and I froze. My heartbeat surged, hammering in my ears. Michael should have returned by now. He should have walked back with that easy confidence. I started down the narrow path he'd taken, calling his name softly. "Michael!" My voice sounded wrong in the stillness, too loud and too fragile. I reached the undergrowth, pushing branches aside, the soil soft and damp under my boots. Nothing, just empty trees and shadows that clung like sticky webs. A few yards in, I found his jacket lying on a moss-covered log, green, worn, and completely out of place, as if it had been discarded. My stomach knotted. I crouched and lifted it, half expecting some rational explanation. Fallen pack, a prank, a detour. But the pockets were empty. No wallet, no phone, nothing. Just fabric. Then I heard the whispers again. This time closer, almost behind me. I spun, expecting to see Michael laughing, a squirrel, anything. But there was only the forest, silent and indifferent. My heart raced faster. I called his name again, louder this time, but the sound seemed to vanish almost immediately, absorbed by the trees. I turned back toward the main trail. Somewhere along the way, I felt like I was being watched. Not the kind of glance you sense from someone you know. It was deeper, patient, like the forest itself was aware of me. Each step I took sounded impossibly loud. I imagined shadows moving just at the edge of vision, flickering, vanishing when I looked straight at them. Then I saw it, footprints, human footprints pressed into the wet soil. But they weren't consistent with Michael's shoes. They were smaller, lighter, almost delicate. They led off the trail, spiraling deeper into the forest. I wanted to follow, but some primal fear held me back. Instead, I photographed them with my phone, hands trembling, and turned back to where the trail curved. The sun was higher now, and yet the forest felt colder. I shouted his name again. Only silence answered, and the whispering that had once been faint now seemed to swirl around me, just beyond comprehension. My mind fought between reason and panic. Could someone have taken him? Did he get lost? Or was it something else entirely, something the townspeople feared even to speak about? I ran back to the trailhead, my lungs burning, hoping anyone would be there. But the parking lot was empty. The silence was absolute. I felt a shift then, a tightening in the chest, like the forest had closed in behind me while I wasn't looking. Michael was gone, completely. Days later, the authorities searched. Hikers, volunteers, even dogs combed the forest. Nothing. No trace. No footprints matching his, no belongings, nothing in the streams or under the thick ferns. Just the whispers. Every search report mentioned the same strange feeling. People claimed they heard faint calling, footsteps behind them, shadows that moved when they blinked. I didn't return to Hollow Creek for a long time. But even months later, I'd lie in bed and hear a faint rustle, a soft voice carrying from nowhere, and I'd feel that old fear creeping up my spine. Something about that forest sticks to you. It doesn't let go. People ask why I went with him that morning. Curiosity, foolishness, maybe both. Or maybe it was something deeper, the lure of the unknown, the pull of the forest itself. The thing is, I can't forget the way it felt to stand there, the empty trail stretching ahead, the soft whispers swirling around, promising answers that never came. Sometimes at night, I dream of the trail. I see Michael's jacket on the log, I hear the whispers, I follow them, and I never reach him. Every time the forest shifts, reshapes itself, and I wake up with my chest tight, heart pounding, a deep, nagging sense that I've left something behind, something waiting. And maybe I have. I still wonder who or what picked him up. Was it another person, some cruel trap lying in wait? Or was it the forest itself, patient and quiet, claiming what wandered too far, leaving only whispers behind? I don't know, and I suspect I never will. What I do know is this. Every time I hear the wind rustle through the trees, or a faint branch snap when no one is near, I think of Hollow Creek. I think of Michael, and I realize the forest doesn't just remember him. It remembers me too. I thought the first day on the trail had been unsettling enough. Hollow Creek had already claimed a piece of my confidence, leaving me nervous with every rustle of leaves. But that evening, when the sun began to sink behind the trees, I realized how small the forest could make you feel, how easy it was to convince yourself you weren't alone, even when no one was supposed to be there. The trail was narrow, lined with towering pines and birches whose branches intertwined above, forming a kind of shadowed cathedral. The last remnants of sunlight sifted through the needles, painting the dirt in streaks of gold and gray. My pack felt heavier than it had that morning. Each step made a soft crunching sound that echoed oddly, almost accusingly, through the quiet. And then I heard it, footsteps. Not mine, not my companion, someone else. They were slow at first, careful, measured, barely louder than the whisper of the wind across the trees. I froze, forcing myself to listen. 1, 2, pause, 1, 2, pause. The rhythm was deliberate, like someone was testing the trail, the same way a predator might circle its prey. I called out softly, "Hello." My voice felt small, ridiculous. There was no reply. Only the footsteps continued, keeping that strange, patient cadence. I wanted to turn, to run, to find the source, but some part of me needed to know who or what was behind me. I started walking again, slow, cautious, keeping my eyes on the trail ahead but straining to catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. The footsteps mirrored me, matching my pace, sometimes a hair behind, sometimes almost in sync. Each time I glanced over my shoulder, nothing was there, just trees, just shadow. I remembered something the local ranger had told me a week earlier over the phone. "People hear things in Hollow Creek," he said. "Footsteps. Voices, sometimes they find signs of people who were never there. You hear them too, I laughed then, politely, pretending to brush it off. Now I was starting to believe him. The trail curved into a small clearing half covered with ferns. I stopped, dropped my pack, and crouched, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The steps halted too. Silence, just the wind. Then, faintly, a snap. A small branch breaking as if someone had stepped on it a few feet behind me. I spun around again. Nothing. Nothing but the shifting shadows of the forest. I tried to convince myself it was another hiker. Maybe someone coming late to set up camp. But I knew better. There was no human rhythm to these footsteps, too precise, too deliberate. And Hollow Creek had a way of making you feel observed, of amplifying every sound until your imagination became a trap. I picked up my pack, moving slowly, careful not to startle whatever was there. The forest seemed different now, alive in a way I couldn't explain. Each tree looked like it was leaning just slightly, listening. Each shadow seemed to curl toward me, and every step I took was echoed by that same quiet, stalking rhythm. My mind wandered, trying to connect the dots. The ranger had mentioned missing persons, hikers who vanished without trace. Footprints that led to nothing, backpacks left in the middle of the trail, shoes by the creek with no owner. All the reports said the same thing. The forest keeps its secrets, and if it decides to claim someone, no one ever finds them. The thought tightened my chest. Could this be what had happened to Michael? The trail behind me seemed endless, stretching into deeper shadows. My feet moved faster, crunching against the damp earth. The footsteps quickened too, keeping pace, always just behind me. My throat tightened. My hands shook. I stopped suddenly, letting the forest swallow my silence. For a moment, nothing. Then, faintly, the sound of breathing. Not mine. Close enough to feel the vibration in the air, but far enough to remain unseen. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. My legs felt rooted in mud, in fear. I took a deep breath and called out again, louder this time. "Who's there?" My voice cracked. No answer. Only the footsteps resumed, softer now, weaving in and out of the underbrush, teasing, never revealing. I remembered the stories about Hollow Creek, how people reported hearing footsteps that followed them for miles, only to vanish when they dared to look. How some would follow the sounds, drawn deeper into the forest, only to disappear themselves. I shivered. Was it coincidence that I was alone at dusk, hearing the same rhythm? Or was the forest itself orchestrating this, feeding on curiosity and fear? I tried to rationalize it, focusing on something tangible. Maybe it was a deer, something small hopping through the undergrowth. But the rhythm was too steady, too human. It was calculated, and it was following me, always following me. As the sun dipped below the horizon, shadows lengthened, becoming darker, heavier. My flashlight, which I'd been carrying but reluctant to use, suddenly felt necessary. I clicked it on. The beam sliced through the forest, illuminating tree trunks, fallen logs, and ferns. Nothing moved. Nothing visible, at least. But the footsteps continued, now mingling with the snapping of twigs, like someone was testing my nerves, pushing boundaries I didn't know I had. I realized then that I had stopped listening to the trail behind me and started listening to myself. My heartbeat, rapid, uneven, loud in my ears. My breath, ragged, shallow. The forest seemed to echo every thought, every fear, amplifying it. And always the faint echo of footsteps, never more than a few paces behind. I began to notice patterns. At certain points, the steps would pause, almost synchronized with my own. I'd walk faster and they'd quicken. I'd stop, holding my breath, and they would halt. It was a game, or perhaps a warning, or maybe just the forest reminding me that it was alive in ways I couldn't see. The clearing opened to a small creek, water whispering over stones. I knelt to fill my bottle, thinking maybe the sound of the running water could drown out the footsteps, could calm me. But when I lifted my head, the footsteps had moved closer. I hadn't heard them approach. They were there, just behind the trees. I backed away slowly, feeling the ground shift beneath me. A branch snapped under my weight. Then another, almost simultaneously, somewhere in the shadows. And then silence. Complete, suffocating silence. The kind that pressed against your ears, your chest, your skin. I told myself I imagined it. I had to. Humans make noise when they panic. The forest makes noise when it's alive. And I was alone, or so I hoped. Night fell fully then. The forest transformed into a place that belonged to shadows. Every rustle became a threat, every shifting fern a hiding place. I kept moving, always forward, never looking back. And yet the rhythm persisted, soft, patient, unrelenting. Footsteps in sync with my heartbeat, in time with my fear. When I finally saw the trailhead lights in the distance, I felt a surge of relief. Maybe it was over. Maybe the forest would let me leave. But even as I approached, the echo of footsteps lingered in my mind, pressing on my chest. Hollow Creek had taught me that the forest remembers, and it doesn't forget. I didn't stop walking until I was in my car, doors locked, engine running, heartbeat still racing. The shadows of the trees stretched across the windshield, impossibly long in the moonlight. And in the quiet hum of the motor, I thought I heard a faint tap, like a boot against the roof. I told myself it was the wind. I wanted it to be the wind, but the rhythm in my chest told me otherwise. Even now, days later, I replay that evening in my mind. Every footstep, every snap of a branch, every pause in the forest's breath. I wonder if the next hiker to enter Hollow Creek will hear them too. If they'll understand that the forest doesn't just watch, it follows, it remembers, and sometimes it decides. I keep thinking about Michael, about how footsteps can vanish, how someone can disappear without trace. And I realize that when you walk in Hollow Creek, the forest isn't just around you. It's inside you, tracking, waiting. And the moment you hear those steps behind you, you know you are never truly alone. The moment I stumbled across the campsite, I knew it wasn't just abandoned. Something about it pressed against me, heavy and deliberate, like the forest had arranged it for me to find. The tent was slumped, fabric torn and yellowed with age. Stakes had rusted through the soft soil, leaning at odd angles, and the fire pit was cold. Nothing but ash and the faintest scent of smoke that hung stubbornly in the air. I crouched down, brushing my fingers over the ash. Not old ash, recent enough that it carried the ghost of warmth. Maybe someone had been here days ago. Maybe weeks, I couldn't tell. But the footprints around the tent suggested more than one person had been here. Small, large, some dragging, some careful, almost rehearsed. Whoever it was, they had left in a hurry, or not at all. The pack that leaned against the tree caught my eye next. Worn canvas, half open, spilling its contents onto the mossy ground. A pair of hiking boots, muddy, scuffed. A torn jacket, green, familiar, like I'd seen it before. My heart skipped. I picked up the jacket, trembling, and recognized it immediately. Michael's. I froze, my stomach twisted. I didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was undeniable. He had been here, or someone had used his things. The forest didn't give up clues easily, but this was almost cruel in its clarity. My mind raced, questions piling over each other. Why leave the belongings? Where had he gone? Had he been taken? Or had he run, terrified of something I couldn't yet imagine? The air was still, too still. The birds had gone quiet. Even the creek's whisper seemed distant now, like the forest had swallowed every sound. I took a slow step forward, trying to examine the tent closer. The flap was half open, sagging as though it had been forced. Inside, there was nothing but a thin, moldy mat and scattered leaves. No sleeping bag, no supplies. Just the faintest trace of human scent, old and sour, clinging stubbornly. Something about that smell made me nauseous. I gagged slightly, pulling back, and that's when I noticed the marks on the ground, scrapes, shallow but deliberate. A struggle, maybe. The way the earth had been disturbed suggested more than careless camping. Someone or something had been dragged or had fallen. My pulse quickened, my stomach turned. I wanted to turn back to leave, but my curiosity, my guilt, kept me rooted. I stepped around the fire pit, flashlight cutting swaths through the dimming light. A discarded water bottle rolled slightly in the breeze. My boot nudged it, and I bent to examine it. Fingerprints, smudges, I didn't know. It was just plastic, ordinary. But something about it lying there alone made my skin crawl. It was a remnant of life, ordinary yet haunting in its stillness. I moved to the far side of the campsite, brushing aside a clump of ferns. Something glimmered in the mud. A ring? No, a small knife, blade dulled and handle worn. Not left behind carelessly, it had been dropped. Or placed. The thought that someone had been here, someone I didn't want to imagine, made me step back instinctively. The forest shifted around me, shadows leaning closer. Every branch that snapped under my feet sounded louder, every rustle amplified. I imagined eyes following me from the trees, hidden, patient, waiting. My mind tried to anchor itself in reason, reminding me that nothing was watching, that I was alone. But the evidence around me argued otherwise. Michael had been here. Something had happened. And whatever it was, the forest had swallowed it whole. I returned to the tent, trying to piece together a timeline. The footprints, the scuffed boots, the knife, the disturbed ground. Someone had camped here, then vanished, or been forced to vanish. I thought about the rangers' warnings, the local stories about Hollow Creek, people disappearing without trace, signs of a campsite with no owner ever found. The forest had a way of hiding things it didn't want to be found. I crouched by the fire pit again, examining the ashes. One small blackened piece of cloth caught my attention. I picked it up, fingers trembling. A torn sleeve, thin, almost child-sized. My stomach dropped. I didn't want to think about what it meant. Did someone else come here? Was Michael not alone? Or was this just another layer of the forest's cruel design, a remnant of a camper long gone, a warning disguised as evidence? I moved carefully around the campsite, scanning the trees. Something caught my eye, a small, broken branch hanging unnaturally low. When I lifted my flashlight, I saw faint scratches on the bark, shallow but jagged, too deliberate to be accidental, almost like claw marks. My chest tightened. I stepped back slowly. If something had been here, what had it taken? And was it still watching? The shadows of the forest stretched as the sun dipped further. The light bled from gold to gray, and with each passing minute the campsite felt colder, older, more unwilling to let me leave. I could almost hear the echo of someone moving through the trees behind me, soft, careful, never close enough to see. Footsteps again. Not my own, not Michael's. Someone or something, still lingering, waiting unseen. I found a partially hidden notebook under a rock near the tent. Pages yellowed, edges curled, water-stained. Flipping it open, I saw scrawled notes, barely legible. Times, dates, mentions of the shadows, and they follow. My hands shook. This wasn't just a campsite. It was a record. Someone had been keeping track. Someone had feared something in this forest and wanted to remember it or warn others. I read through a few more lines. Mentions of footprints that vanished, whispers that led travelers astray, campsites discovered empty. Each line made the hair on my arm stand on end. And then a date, recent. Only a few days ago. Whoever had written this was here, or had been taken, or maybe had survived just long enough to leave it behind for me to find. A sudden breeze moved through the clearing. Tent flaps shivered. Leaves rustled across the ground. The forest felt alive, patient, almost sentient. I imagined faces peering from the shadows, bodies pressed low against the underbrush, watching. My stomach twisted with the realization that whatever had been here might still be here, lingering, keeping the campsite as a memory, as a trap, as a warning. I noticed then that the footprints I had seen earlier didn't all leave the campsite. Some seemed to vanish right at the edge of the clearing, as if the ground itself had swallowed them. I followed them cautiously, half expecting to see Michael, half expecting to see nothing. And yet the forest seemed to shift around me, to hide what it didn't want found. My flashlight flickered slightly in the gloom, and I cursed under my breath, praying it was just batteries. I retraced my steps through the campsite one more time. Knife, jacket, torn cloth, notebook, fire pit. Everything remained exactly where I had found it, as though frozen in time. And yet there was a sense that someone or something had been moving among these items while I wasn't looking. The air carried a faint, coppery scent, like old blood or decaying leaves or something I didn't want to name. The sky darkened, shadows pooling across the clearing. I realized I had been standing there too long. My legs ached. My mind reeled with what I had found. And then I understood something I hadn't before. Hollow Creek didn't just claim people. It claimed their stories, their spaces, their sense of reality. The campsite wasn't empty. It was a shrine, a warning, a trap frozen in time. I left carefully, my flashlight illuminating the path ahead. The shadows of the trees twisted in strange ways, and I felt the forest watching, remembering. Every crackle of leaves, every whisper of wind reminded me that the forest didn't forget. It didn't forgive, and it didn't release what it claimed without reason. Even now, days later, I can't forget that campsite. I replay the evidence over and over, the jacket, the footprints, the knife, the notebook. And I can't stop thinking, someone had been here. Someone had left traces of fear behind. And Michael had been part of that story. I know the forest holds more than it reveals. I know Hollow Creek doesn't end with what we see. And I know without a doubt that the campsite was only a fragment of the truth. What it hides, I can't yet name. But I can feel it, patient and waiting, like the footsteps at dusk, like the shadows in the pines. The forest doesn't just surround you, it follows, and it remembers. The deeper I went into Hollow Creek, the more I felt the forest watching. Not just seeing, not just hearing, but waiting. The air had thickened, each breath tasting of damp moss and something faintly metallic, like blood long forgotten. My boots pressed into the soft earth, and every step seemed amplified, echoing unnaturally among the trunks. Somewhere a branch cracked, but it was too precise, too deliberate to be random. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, that my mind, jittery from fear and the day's discoveries, was filling in gaps the forest left behind. But the whispers began shortly after the sun disappeared behind the horizon, soft and almost indistinguishable from the wind at first. One syllable here, a faint sigh there, a voice that seemed to float just beyond comprehension. I stopped walking. The forest held its breath with me. The sound grew, layered, a chorus of hushed voices, almost chanting, almost questioning. My pulse quickened. I strained to understand the words. Something about them made the hairs on my arms stand straight. Not words I recognized, more like fragments of syllables, half-formed sentences, as if the forest itself was trying to communicate in a language I could almost grasp. I reached a small clearing, moonlight spilling weakly through the trees. Shadows pooled in the corners, twisting unnaturally. I thought I saw movement at the edges, fleeting glimpses that vanished when I turned my flashlight on them. Each time I swore I caught a human shape, slender, crouched, watching. Or maybe it was only my imagination, only the way the mind clings to hope and fear alike. I thought about Michael, about the campsite, the torn jacket, the knife, the notebook with its scrawled warnings. The forest had already shown me it remembered those who entered. The whispers suggested the same, that it kept more than memories. It kept secrets and maybe even lives. I tried to rationalize, telling myself I was seeing shadows where there were none, hearing voices in the wind. But every instinct in me screamed otherwise. I took another step forward, boots pressing into soft soil that seemed to give way just slightly, almost unnaturally. The whispering intensified, circling me now. Not coming from a single direction, but all around, echoing, overlapping, a subtle chorus of sounds that made my ears ring. I wanted to call out, to speak, to break the spell, but my voice caught in my throat. Something brushed past me then. Not air, not wind. Something with weight, deliberate, careful. My heart jumped. I spun, shining the light, but the clearing was empty. Only the shadows remained, stretching, writhing, uncooperative. I took a step backward. Something moved in the periphery, just beyond the edge of the beam. I couldn't identify it. It didn't run, didn't approach. It simply existed, hovering, patient. I remembered the stories, the rangers' warnings. Hollow Creek didn't just claim people. It claimed their sense of reality, twisting it, bending it until you couldn't trust your own eyes or ears. The whispers were part of it, I realized. The first sign the forest was awake, and aware and watching. I started walking again, slowly, cautiously, trying to keep my flashlight trained ahead. Every step seemed to echo, every breath amplified. And then I noticed the footprints, tiny, delicate, human-like, weaving in impossible patterns around the clearing. They didn't lead anywhere. They disappeared mid-step as though the earth itself had swallowed them. My stomach twisted. Whoever or whatever had made them hadn't left but hadn't gone either. The whispers shifted again, higher now, urgent, a rising tide of sound that pressed against my skull. I clutched my head, shutting my eyes briefly, wishing it would stop. When I opened them, the clearing had changed. The shadows seemed closer, darker, as if the trees themselves had bent inward. My flashlight flickered once, then steadied, but the air felt charged, alive, hostile. I stepped forward, boots trembling, and suddenly the whispers coalesced into a form I could almost see. At first, just a shape among the trees, a figure, slender, crouched, observing, but then another, and another. Dozens of them, hidden, shifting in the dark, appearing and vanishing in the blink of an eye. Not attacking, not running, just existing. Watching. Waiting. A breeze carried a faint metallic scent. I gagged, pulling my scarf higher over my nose. The whispers grew louder, and for the first time I felt a cold understanding. A certainty that Hollow Creek had noticed me. That it remembered Michael. That it was aware I was retracing his steps. That awareness pressed on me like a weight, slow and inexorable. I moved forward, flashlight bouncing over the moss-covered trunks. Each tree seemed to lean just slightly toward me, as if part of the living cathedral that surrounded the clearing. Every snap of a twig was a question, every rustle a warning. And the whispers, always just at the edge of comprehension, hinted at stories I didn't want to know. Tales of campers who vanished, hikers who walked straight into shadows and were never seen again, voices that led them away from safety. I realized the forest wasn't just a place. It was a presence, something that existed beyond the logic of humans. And I was part of its story now, another narrative woven into the hollow spaces between trees, into the soft soil, into the whispers that never ceased. I stepped into a small depression where the ground sloped toward a creek, moonlight silvering the water. The whispers followed, circling, almost echoing against the stones. I bent down, tracing the edge of the creek with my fingers. Something brushed past me in the water. A reflection, maybe, but it was wrong, not my own. Something elongated, flickering, human yet not. I pulled back, heart hammering, breath shallow. The whispering crescendoed then, overlapping voices layering over each other. Some sounded urgent, pleading, some mocking, some warning. I realized that in the brief moments of clarity I could almost understand fragments. Go back, follow, never leave. They remember. My skin crawled. The forest was speaking and I was listening. I backed away from the creek, flashlight sweeping across the clearing, across the edges where the trees met shadow. And I thought I saw movement again. Not a figure this time, but something like a distortion of the air, a heat wave twisting the night, a shimmer that shouldn't exist in the cold moonlight. I blinked. It vanished, but the feeling remained, as if the forest had exhaled in my face, leaving its presence lingering. I realized then that Hollow Creek didn't need to take you to claim you. Just the knowledge that it was alive, aware, patient, was enough to change you. To make you hear whispers when there were none, see shadows where there was only moonlight, question your own senses until you couldn't trust them. I felt it pressing against my mind, folding me into the forest's narrative. A sudden rustle to my left made me spin. Nothing, only shadows, only the faint glimmer of moonlight on wet leaves. My pulse raced. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run. And yet something in me wanted to stay, to see it, to understand it, even though I knew understanding might mean losing myself. The whispers softened, almost teasing now, curling around my ears in tones both familiar and alien. I caught fragments, words that almost formed sentences. My name, Michael, Hollow, follow, stop, wait. It was impossible to discern meaning. The forest had a language of its own, subtle, patient, precise, and I was learning it too late. I looked around the clearing one last time. The tent, the ashes, the scattered belongings, all remnants of the people who had entered before me, the stories they had left behind. And then I noticed a shadow detach itself from a tree, not fully formed, not solid, a flicker, a glimpse of a presence that didn't belong to the physical world. It moved with the rhythm of the whispers, a slow, deliberate dance between light and dark. I stepped back, my flashlight caught the shimmer briefly. Then nothing, just moonlight and silence. I could still hear the faint rustle, the echo of footsteps I hadn't taken, whispers that weren't words but carried meaning all the same. The forest had spoken. It had remembered. And I understood with that cold certainty that some stories never end. Some people never leave. I turned toward the trail, my legs heavy, every sense straining. But the whispers didn't stop. The shadows didn't retreat. They lingered at the edges, patient, always aware. Hollow Creek had marked me. Its voice had entered my mind. And even as I walked away, I knew it would not let me go entirely. The forest doesn't forgive. It doesn't forget. And it doesn't release what it claims. Even now, in the quiet of my home, I can hear it. Faint, persistent, a whisper curling around the edges of my consciousness, telling me to remember, telling me that the story is not finished, that the shadows are patient, that Hollow Creek is alive. And I know I will hear it again. The road began as a thin ribbon of asphalt cutting through the pine forest, disappearing into a curve so sharp it seemed designed to trap anyone daring enough to follow it. I shouldn't have come this way. The locals had warned me, with sideways glances and nervous laughs that didn't reach their eyes, murmuring about people who walked into these woods and never walked out. I laughed too at first, telling myself it was just old-timer superstition, stories told to scare hikers and writers. But the moment I drove past the last visible house, the warning sank into my chest like a stone. The air changed, thickened. Even through the closed windows, I could smell the damp pine, sweet but heavy, almost choking. I rolled the window down slightly and let the scent wash over me. It was clean, earthy, almost comforting, except it carried something else, something faintly metallic, like blood lingering in the roots of the soil. I shook my head, probably imagining it. The sun was low now, brushing gold along the treetops, but the forest below had already fallen into shadow. I slowed the car, feeling the gravel crunch under the tires louder than it should. The trees leaned inward, tall and dark, blocking the remaining light. The cabin wasn't far, or so I thought. Yet with every curve, the road seemed to stretch, twisting farther than memory should allow. I passed a broken sign. Old Creek Road, the letters faded, edges splintered. Behind it, the woods pressed close. Something about the way the shadows moved made my stomach tight. I told myself it was wind, branches scraping against one another. But a part of me, deep, quiet, and insistent, knew it was more. Something was watching, something was aware. When I finally saw the cabin, it was almost hidden behind a wall of evergreens. A small structure, wood darkened with age and moss, windows staring blankly. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, thin, deliberate, not curling like a fire in use but lingering like a memory. I parked the car on the uneven dirt beside it, boots crunching the frost-hardened leaves. Every step sounded loud, intrusive in the forest's silence. I hesitated at the door. Locals had told me stories, disappearances, campers never returning, footprints ending abruptly in the woods. Some said it was the creek, others whispered of something that lived between the pines. I didn't believe them. I wanted to believe them. But now, standing here, the forest around me quiet and patient, I realized belief had little to do with it. Fear had more to do with survival. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and damp. Furniture sagged under decades of neglect. A table, 2 chairs, a small wood stove. Dust motes hung in shafts of fading light. Nothing seemed unusual, and yet the air felt wrong. It pressed against my chest. Slow and insidious, I ran my hand along the table. Rough, splintered wood, but underneath a faint stickiness. Something old, something left behind. I noticed then the notes pinned to the wall near the stove. Yellowed scraps of paper, scribbled warnings, names, dates. Most illegible, but one stood out. Do not follow the road after sunset. They take what you cannot see. My pulse jumped. My rational mind whispered it was just a warning, folks playing into superstition. But my gut said otherwise. The handwriting trembled, rushed, anxious. Someone had feared for their life here. I moved to the window, peering through grime at the forest. The pines swayed slightly, though no wind stirred. Shadows pooled, stretching unnaturally across the ground. Something flickered at the edge of my vision. I turned and nothing was there. Just the forest, quiet, patient, watching. I decided to step outside to explore the immediate area. The frost crunched underfoot, trees looming, their trunks like silent sentinels. I kept thinking about the stories, the missing hikers, the whispers locals claimed to hear, the footprints that vanished mid-step. Each tale I had laughed off now gnawed at the edges of my mind. What if there was truth to them? What if the forest remembered and watched and waited? A sudden rustle made me freeze. Nothing. Only the trees, only the earth. I shook my head, forcing a laugh. I told myself it was just nerves. Cabin isolation has that effect. The further you are from the warmth of civilization, the louder the small things become. But still, the hair on my arm stood on end. I walked toward the creek I knew ran behind the cabin, water whispering over rocks. It was shallow, almost gentle, but in the silence of the woods it sounded like a roar. I followed it a few steps, then stopped. Tracks, footprints in the soft mud, human, recent. Bare feet, small, leading away, curving into the trees, and then nothing. Vanished. The earth seemed to have swallowed them. I felt a chill, fingers tightening around the flashlight. Questions piled over each other. Who had been here before me? Why had they left in such a hurry? Or had they been taken? My rational mind refused to settle on an answer. The forest had claimed them, yes, but why? And was it waiting for me too? The shadows shifted again. I could feel it in my chest, the air heavy, dense. Every instinct screamed at me to go back inside, to lock the door, to ignore the road beyond. Yet another part, stubborn, curious, forced me onward. I needed to understand. I needed to see. I returned to the cabin, scanning the interior once more. On the floor, faint scratches marred the wood. Not random. Someone or something had moved here recently. The thought made my stomach tight. I wondered if they had left warnings, or if the forest itself had arranged them like a message. Messages meant for those who dared to enter. Messages meant to test sanity. I tried to settle on the couch, wood groaning under my weight. Darkness fell faster than the sun itself. Shadows pooled inside the cabin, and for the first time I understood that isolation didn't make the forest less dangerous. It made it patient. It waited for fear to grow, to root itself in the mind. I felt my thoughts scatter, each one a whisper in the hollow silence. Outside, something moved, something deliberate. I didn't look directly. I didn't need to. I could feel its presence through the walls, subtle, deliberate, patient. It wasn't human, or maybe it had once been. My pulse thundered in my ears, but I forced myself to breathe slowly. Fear wasn't panic. Fear was awareness, and I needed to survive the night. I examined the notes again. Names, dates, warnings, every one a fragment of a life interrupted. Every one a story that ended too soon. I couldn't stop thinking about them. Michael, Lisa, the hiker I had read about last year, gone without trace. All warnings of the same forest, of the same road. And now I was on it, moving deeper, my curiosity anchoring me to a path that might not end. I finally stepped to the window again, eyes straining to pierce the darkness beyond. The road curled into shadow, endless, uninviting. Somewhere along it, someone or something was waiting, waiting patiently, unseen. I felt the weight of it pressing against the glass, through the wood, into my chest. Hollow Creek wasn't just a place. It was awareness. It was memory. It was something older than the stories, something that claimed anyone daring enough to enter. And as night fell fully, the cabin felt smaller, more fragile. The walls pressed in, and the shadows outside seemed to pulse with life. The forest was awake now. It knew I was here. It remembered. And I realized with a sinking certainty that the road to nowhere wasn't just a path. It was a warning, a test, a beginning. I didn't know then how deep it went, or how many had walked it before me, never to return. I only knew the whisper of the trees, the rustle of unseen feet in the dark, and the relentless patience of a forest that remembered everything. I pulled my coat tighter and turned away from the window. The night was long, and the road stretched far beyond what my eyes could see. I would walk it because I had to. But the forest had already claimed part of me, the part that questioned, that doubted, that wondered. And I knew before the first night had passed that Hollow Creek was alive. watching, waiting. The cabin had already begun to feel like it was breathing around me. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the old timbers pressed in on my thoughts. I told myself to calm down, that it was just the house settling, the night shifting outside, the wind threading through the cracks in the walls. But something deeper told me otherwise, something more patient, observing. I moved toward the far corner of the main room, flashlight trembling in my grip. There was a door there I hadn't noticed at first. Dark wood, slightly warped with age and locked. No key in sight, no handle other than the simple iron latch. I pressed my ear against it. Silence. Or at least nothing I could understand. But even in that silence, I felt the cabin's pulse quicken, like it knew I had discovered it. The hinges groaned as I tugged at the latch, locked tight. The kind of lock that suggested it hadn't been opened in years, maybe decades. And yet, something about the air leaking through the edges was alive. It smelled faintly of damp earth, of decay, of something coppery that made my stomach tight. I crouched and ran a hand along the doorframe. Scratches. Small, deliberate, as if someone or something had been trying to get out, or in. I thought about the locals again. Their warnings. Their nervous laughter that didn't reach their eyes. Some part of me wanted to ignore it, to tell myself it was just superstition, old stories, a little cabin in the woods that had seen too many travelers. But curiosity anchored me, stubborn and heavy. The lock wouldn't budge, but I could sense the room beyond. Felt it. Felt the weight of its secrets pressing against the door. I circled the cabin, flashlight catching the outlines of the furniture. Dust settled thick here, heavier than before, and the notes I had found yesterday whispered their warnings in my mind. I wondered what the hidden room had contained. What stories, what tragedies. The longer I stared at the door, the more I imagined shapes shifting just beyond the wood, shadows that flexed like muscle under the surface. I found a crowbar in the corner, rusted but serviceable. My hands shook as I lifted it, trying to ignore the sound of my own heartbeat hammering in my chest. I placed it against the latch and pushed. The metal scraped, high and grating. A thrill ran through me, a mix of fear and exhilaration that almost made my rational thoughts disappear. Almost. The lock resisted at first. Then with a shuddering creak it gave, slowly, reluctantly, like the door itself was alive and resenting my intrusion. I pressed my shoulder against it, shoved, and it opened just enough to slip through. The darkness beyond was absolute, swallowing my flashlight's beam in an almost viscous black. Inside, the air was colder. Not just colder, thicker, heavier, suffused with the smell of damp wood, mold, and something else. Something I couldn't place, a faint iron tang that hinted at old wounds or forgotten pain. My steps were careful, each one deliberate, ears straining for the softest sound. The room felt, unwilling to be observed, as if it resented my presence. On the far wall, strange markings caught my eye. Etched into the wood with careful precision, symbols I didn't recognize. Circles, lines, spirals, shapes that reminded me of ritual, of intent, of someone trying to communicate across boundaries I wasn't meant to understand. Some were blackened, charred at the edges, as if fire had been applied in tiny bursts, while others were raw, clean. Freshly carved, or at least they appeared that way. My stomach knotted. Whoever had been here had left messages. Messages meant to warn or to bind. I couldn't tell which. The floor creaked under me as I moved closer. Dust swirled in the narrow beams of my flashlight. My eyes adjusted slowly, tracing the edges of the room. Small objects littered the corners, fragments of cloth, a half-broken chair, what looked like a notebook water-stained and fragile with age. The pages were illegible, but I could see frantic handwriting, scribbled margins, frantic symbols mirroring the carvings on the walls. I thought about Michael, about the hikers who had disappeared, about the stories I had read but never truly believed. Each detail of the cabin, each mark, each fragment seemed to link back to them. The forest outside, the hidden road, the secrets of the cabin, they all converged here in this locked room. I felt as though I were peering into the memory of something long dead but unwilling to let go. A sudden shift of air brushed my neck. I froze, not a draft but the subtle sense of a presence. I turned slowly, flashlight trembling. The corners of the room were empty, yet the feeling remained. It didn't move like a human. It didn't breathe like a human, but it was aware, patient, and waiting. I swallowed hard, trying to push back the rising terror. I stepped closer to the markings on the wall, running my fingers lightly over the carved lines. The wood was cool, almost alive beneath my touch. I traced one of the spirals and a shiver ran through me. It felt intentional, calculated, as if the room itself had been designed to channel attention, to pull the observer into its pattern. A whispering seemed to drift just beyond hearing. Not words, not yet, but a tone, a vibration that pressed at the edges of my consciousness. I caught my breath and forced myself to look around again. There were small scratches along the floorboards leading toward the back wall, toward a section of wood that seemed slightly warped, almost out of alignment. I pressed my hand against it. Hollow. My mind raced. Was this a false wall? A hidden compartment? Another secret layer hiding more than I could imagine? The thought made my stomach twist. My hands trembled as I explored the edges. The air felt heavier here, thicker, almost pressing back against me. I felt a subtle heat at the base of my skull, a tension that wasn't mine alone. I couldn't explain it, couldn't rationalize it. The room itself seemed aware, its history a kind of living memory pressing against me. I knelt to examine the notebook on the floor. Water-stained pages revealed symbols matching the carvings, names, dates, and notes that suggested observation, warnings, and ritual. I flipped the fragile pages carefully. One entry caught my attention. They remember the footsteps. They remember the watchers. Enter carefully. Leave nothing behind. Do not listen to the voice of the shadows. I froze. Footsteps, watchers, shadows. My heart thumped hard in my chest. I had felt them already in the main cabin in the way the floorboards groaned under my weight. And now in this locked room, their presence seemed closer, sharper, more insistent. I was not alone. I had never been alone. I rose slowly, moving to the far corner of the room. There, partially hidden under dust and debris, was a hatch, small, square, and flush with the floor. My flashlight flickered as I hovered above it. The air coming from beneath was colder and carried that same metallic tang, subtle but undeniable. My pulse raced. Another layer, another secret waiting for me below. I forced myself to step back. The room, the cabin, the forest outside, they were layered with stories. Some meant to warn, some meant to trap, and some, I realized with a hollow feeling, were meant to make intruders like me question everything they thought they understood. I had found the locked room, but I hadn't found its truth. Not yet. The shadows in the corners seemed to shift, elongating as if they were stretching toward me. The whispers, faint and rhythmic, teased the edges of comprehension. The cabin was patient. The room was patient. And now I understood. The forest had not abandoned this place. It had left it alive, aware, waiting for someone curious enough to open the door. I stepped back, letting the hatch remain unopened. The air settled, slightly less oppressive, but the tension remained. The locked room had revealed a fraction of its secrets. Enough to unsettle, enough to warn, enough to anchor me in the knowledge that what I had entered was alive with history, memory, and perhaps a consciousness I could never fully understand. I turned to leave, flashlight bouncing across the strange markings one last time. The scratches, the carvings, the symbols, they were warnings but also invitations. And I realized with a cold certainty that I hadn't seen the end of it. I had opened the first layer of a story that refused closure, a secret the cabin had held for decades, and now the forest, the walls, the shadows, they would remember me. As I closed the main door behind me, I felt the weight of the room lingering, pressing lightly like a hand on my shoulder I couldn't see. The whispers followed me out, faint, patient, curling through my mind as I returned to the main cabin space. Sleep would not come easily. Questions lingered, and the locked room waited, silent, immovable, and alive. I found them tucked beneath a loose floorboard in the corner of the cabin, yellowed and brittle, the edges curling as if resisting exposure to the air. Newspaper clippings, old and forgotten, each one a frozen fragment of stories no one seemed to want to remember. I pulled them out carefully, letting them unfold like fragile wings. The first article made me pause. The headline was simple, stark. Hiker missing on Ridge Trail, search continues. The photograph beside it was grainy, almost ghost-like. A young man, his smile frozen in time, eyes wide as if warning me. Reading the lines beneath, my stomach tightened. The disappearance had occurred decades ago. Official reports claimed he vanished without trace, but locals had whispered of sightings, of shadows following hikers, of voices in the trees. I held my breath and turned the next clipping over. Another disappearance. Another hiker, another trail, another story swallowed by the forest. Patterns began to emerge, dates spaced months apart, locations all within a narrow radius around the cabin. My pulse quickened. The cabin had been here all that time, a silent witness, and perhaps something more. Something that observed, remembered, waited. There were other clippings too, accounts of sudden deaths. One detailed a man found at the edge of the forest, his expression twisted in terror, no wounds, no explanation. The coroner's report was missing in the archive, or perhaps never filed. I noticed the same symbol scribbled faintly in the margins of some articles, spirals, scratches, marks matching the carvings I had seen in the locked room. It was subtle, almost dismissible, but unmistakable once you saw it. I sank to the floor, stacking the clippings in neat piles, trying to make sense of it all. Each story hinted at something lurking near the cabin, something tied to the forest and the people who wandered too close. The dates, the names, they felt like threads, weaving a tapestry of fear that spanned decades. I traced one name with my finger, a hiker who had vanished in the summer of 1978, a man whose sister had been found wandering days later, incoherent, whispering about voices in the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin itself had been designed to preserve these memories, to draw attention only when someone curious enough arrived. The air around me thickened. Dust motes floated in the flashlight's beam, settling over the clippings like tiny ghosts. And somewhere beneath it all, a low hum seemed to pulse, almost imperceptible, just beyond the edges of my hearing. One article stood out. It wasn't a missing hiker or a mysterious death. It was about the previous owner of the cabin, a man who had vanished without explanation. His name was scrawled in several clippings, connecting him to the disappearances indirectly. The locals had called him a recluse, eccentric, obsessed with the woods and its hidden paths. Rumors suggested he had been studying the patterns of missing persons, documenting them meticulously, always searching for something that no one else could see. I stared at the clipping, heart hammering. Could he have known more than anyone else? Could he have been part of whatever had haunted the trails and the hikers? The thought made my skin prickle. I stacked the papers carefully, but the sense of being watched intensified, pressing against the edges of my consciousness. The cabin seemed to lean in, as if eager for me to discover more. There were maps among the clippings too, hand-drawn, annotated with the same symbols I had seen before. Lines traced through the forest, trails marked in faint pencil, locations circled. I followed one line with my finger, and the air seemed to thicken around me. Each line connected the cabin to sites of past disappearances, forming a lattice of tension across the landscape. I realized that these weren't just stories. They were clues, perhaps warnings, perhaps traps. A sudden creak from the ceiling made me flinch. The cabin was alive in its own way, every groan and shift a reminder of its age, its vigilance. I forced myself to focus on the papers again. One article described the disappearance of a woman last seen near a creek not far from the cabin. She had been a hiker like so many others, and her journal had been found, soaked and smeared. The last entry describing whispers in the trees, shadows that moved against the flow of light. I shivered, imagining her steps, imagining her fear. The pile of clippings grew beneath me, a small monument to the stories the forest had swallowed. I noticed subtle stains on some papers, damp, rust-colored, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable once you saw them. It was as if the forest itself had left reminders, relics of past tragedies pressing through the thin barrier of paper. I ran my fingers over one of the stains and pulled back quickly. The sensation was like touching something alive, something patient and resentful. I began to see the narrative in fragments. Hikers disappearing, deaths unexplained, the previous owner documenting everything, symbols etched into the margins and the walls, lines drawn across maps. It formed a pattern that suggested intent, purpose, maybe obsession. And somewhere beneath the fear, I felt a gnawing curiosity. What had he been trying to find? What had he discovered that the forest had not forgiven him for? The flashlight flickered, and I cursed under my breath, adjusting it to steady the beam. Shadows leapt across the walls as if the room itself was responding to my presence. I realized that these clippings were more than just documents. They were vessels of memory, containers for something the cabin wanted me to understand. And yet, each answer opened more questions. Why had so many disappeared in this particular area? Why had no one outside the forest ever taken notice? I gathered the clippings into a neat stack and examined them one last time. The edges of the papers seemed to hum with the weight of their history, pressing faintly against my palms. I could almost hear whispers behind them, soft and patient, teasing at the edges of comprehension. The cabin had allowed me to find these fragments, but the full story, whatever it was, remained just out of reach. My mind returned to the locked room. The carvings, the spiral symbols, the scratches on the walls, all connected to these clippings. The patterns, the maps, the documents, they were a network, a lattice of intent spanning years, perhaps decades. I realized with a chill that the cabin, the forest, and the previous owner had been engaged in a long, meticulous observation of the world outside, of travelers who ventured too close. And now, perhaps, I had become part of it. I stacked the clippings carefully, returning them to the loose floorboard as I had found them. The act felt almost ceremonial, a silent acknowledgement of the past, a fragile truce with the presence that hovered just beyond sight. But even as I stepped back, the feeling of being watched remained. The air shifted subtly, as if the cabin itself breathed, listening, remembering. I sat down heavily, flashlight casting long shadows across the walls. The past had been uncovered in fragments, but the weight of it pressed down, tangible, inescapable. I thought about the hikers, the missing, the previous owner, and the forest itself. Each story, each disappearance, each note, threads in a web I had only begun to trace. And somewhere in that web, I knew the next revelation waited. I leaned back against the wall, trying to calm my racing heart. The whispers lingered, faint and rhythmic, just beyond comprehension. The clippings had given me a window into the past, but they had also opened the door to questions I was not yet ready to answer. The cabin had secrets, and I had only glimpsed them. Somewhere beyond the shadows, the pattern continued, patient, eternal, and watchful. I rose slowly, the weight of curiosity heavy on my shoulders. The locked room, the strange markings, the old clippings, they were all pieces of a puzzle I was only beginning to understand. And as I stepped toward the corner where the hatch had been, a shiver ran down my spine. The forest outside, the cabin, the shadows, they were alive with memory, waiting for me to make the next move. And I knew with an unsettling certainty that whatever I uncovered next would not only answer questions, it would demand more. More attention, more observation, more reckoning. The past was patient, but so was the cabin. And as I let the clippings settle back into their hiding place, I realized the forest itself had already begun to watch me. The pines stretched high above me, their needles whispering against one another like secrets passing unseen between old friends. Every step I took on the forest floor felt heavier than the last, as if the earth itself resisted my presence. I thought I had heard it first as a trick of the wind, a faint murmur, almost indistinguishable from the soft rustle of leaves. But the sound persisted, subtle, deliberate. A whisper carried through the trees, distant yet intimate, brushing against my thoughts like a cold fingertip. I froze mid-step, the beam of my flashlight trembling over the dark trunks. There was nothing, at least nothing I could see, but the sensation of being watched pressed into my chest. My own breathing seemed too loud, too clumsy, betraying me to whatever waited beyond sight. I told myself it was impossible. The forest was old, yes, dense, yes, but it was also just trees. Yet my instincts refused the comfort of logic. The whispers came again, fragmented, like echoes of a conversation I should not understand. I leaned closer to the base of a pine, trying to locate the source, trying to convince myself I would find a bird, a small animal, anything natural. But the sound was neither creature nor wind. It was deliberate, soft syllables that seemed to drift around me, teasing recognition without granting it. I felt the hairs on my neck stand on end. I continued forward, slow and careful, each step calculated. The ground was uneven, roots twisting like veins beneath the surface, and each step made a hollow crack that sounded far too loud. Shadows clung to the trees, elongated and dark, shapes that refused to solidify. Occasionally, I thought I saw a movement in my peripheral vision, a flicker of something stepping between trunks, but when I turned, nothing remained. The forest was patient. It waited, observing me with a stillness that pressed against my nerves. Minutes stretched, or was it hours? Time here lost its shape. The whispers became more frequent, a low susurration that seemed to rise and fall with the rhythm of my heartbeat. I could almost swear they repeated words I didn't understand, a language I could not place, yet somehow felt familiar. I crouched beside a fallen log, pressing my ear to the rough bark, and the forest seemed to respond. The murmur shifted, recoiling, circling, drawing invisible lines around me. I remembered the newspaper clippings, the missing hikers, the strange patterns. It all converged here in this place beneath the watchful pines. The forest didn't just hold memory, it held intent. I felt it in every subtle shift of shadow, in the way the trees leaned without wind, in the silence that fell when I stopped moving. It was alive in a way that was patient, calculating, almost sentient. A snap echoed from somewhere behind me. My pulse spiked and I spun in a slow circle, flashlight slicing through the dense darkness. Nothing, but the impression lingered, a small tremor in my mind. Something was moving, following, yet it refused to be seen. Each whisper now seemed closer, brushing at my consciousness like a warning. I swallowed hard, telling myself to remain calm, to measure each breath, to focus. Logic was my only weapon, but even logic felt thin here. I took another step, and the forest seemed to bend toward me, narrowing its canopy, pressing the shadows lower. Whispers mingled with the sighing of the trees, a symphony of tension that wrapped around me. I tried to focus on the beam of my flashlight, on the small circle of light at my feet. The forest beyond it was opaque, dark, and impossibly deep. I felt eyes on me, countless, unblinking, and for a moment I could almost see them, glimmers among the pines, watching, patient, calculating. The sensation of being followed intensified. Each time I paused, the whispers would shift, circling, probing, testing my focus. I wondered if the previous owner had felt the same, if the hikers who vanished had heard these same subtle currents, had experienced the patient observation that now gripped me. Fear coiled tight in my stomach, a slow, relentless tension. I couldn't see the watchers, but I could feel their attention like static on the back of my neck. I stumbled over a root and fell forward, scraping my palms against the rough bark of a pine. Pain jolted through me, but I ignored it, focused on the whispering. There was a pattern now, a rhythm I could track. It pulsed when I moved, paused when I froze. It was studying me, adjusting, learning. The forest itself had become a living map of my presence, tracing my path with invisible hands. I leaned against a tree to steady myself, heart hammering. My flashlight flickered, and the beam danced across the shadows, revealing more than I wanted to see. Shapes that had seemed random formed fleeting images, figures, crouched or slouched, glimpsed only for a fraction of a second before retreating into darkness. Each flicker left me breathless, my mind grappling with whether I had imagined them or if they truly existed. The forest blurred the line between reality and something else, a psychological fog that demanded my attention. I forced myself to breathe, focus, analyze. The whispers grew louder, more articulate. I could almost make out syllables, names perhaps, or commands, but clarity eluded me. It was a teasing, a promise of understanding that hovered just out of reach. I knew then that the forest did not simply hide its secrets. It offered glimpses, fragments, to lure the curious deeper. Footsteps? No, too soft, too precise. Not mine, not any animal I knew. Somewhere nearby, a rhythm mirrored mine shifted ahead, then behind, always keeping pace without ever revealing itself. I pressed my back against a tree, listening to the slow, deliberate heartbeat of the forest. The whispers seemed to emanate from every direction, wrapping around me, converging, retreating. I realized I had stepped into something that thrived on observation, on subtle terror, on the patient dismantling of my sense of safety. I thought about the hikers whose fates I had read about, the disappearances, the deaths that had gone unexplained. Their stories seemed to thread through this very forest, echoed in the movements and murmurs I now experienced. I imagined their last moments, a faint understanding creeping into my mind. The forest was patient, but it was never indifferent. It had memory, it had purpose, and it had chosen to notice me. The wind shifted slightly, and I felt a brush of cold air along my neck. I spun again, shining the flashlight in all directions, but the shadows simply rearranged themselves, forming new, unfamiliar shapes that watched from just beyond the reach of light. I could almost sense a pattern in their placement, a choreography that I could not yet comprehend. The forest was alive, and I was a participant in its quiet, invisible game. A brief calm settled, and I allowed myself a shaky exhale. The whispers had receded slightly, though the sensation of eyes on me did not. I crouched low, pressing the flashlight against my knee, trying to map the sounds in my mind. There was a rhythm to them now, an order that suggested intelligence, and I realized with unease that the forest was learning my reactions as quickly as I was trying to track it. I began to move again, cautiously, tracing a path through the pines that I hoped would lead me back toward the cabin. Every step carried weight, every crack of twigs beneath my boots amplified. I felt the whispers shift with me, trailing, retreating, circling. I could no longer trust my own senses, my own judgment. The forest had infiltrated my perception, bending reality to its patient, inscrutable will. Eventually, I saw the outline of the cabin through the trees. Relief surged briefly, only to be tempered by the understanding that I was not alone. The shadows shifted around the trees, never fully separating from my vision. The whispers, though faint, remained, a reminder that the forest had been watching all along. I stepped onto the cabin porch, every muscle tight with residual tension. I looked back into the pines, trying to reassure myself that what I had experienced was merely fear, imagination, perhaps even exhaustion. But the sense of being observed persisted. The forest had left its mark, not on my body, but on my mind. I could feel it in the steady rhythm of my heartbeat, in the way my thoughts returned, unbidden, to the flickering shadows, the murmurs, the patient eyes among the trees. Sitting by the cabin window, I pressed my forehead to the glass and listened. The forest waited. It remembered. And I knew that tonight, and perhaps for many nights to come, I would hear its whispers, feel its gaze, and wonder which parts of it were real, and which belonged entirely to the memory of the forest itself. I thought I had grown used to the cabin, thought the creaks of the floorboards, the shifting shadows in the corners, even the whispering wind outside were things I could tolerate. But that night, when the temperature dropped suddenly, I realized I had been fooling myself. The air carried a weight I hadn't noticed before, thick with anticipation, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. It started with a knock, one sharp, deliberate rap against the cabin door, muffled through the wood, yet impossible to ignore. My first instinct was to convince myself it was a branch, a trick of the wind. But the rhythm was wrong, too steady, too deliberate. I froze, listening. The silence that followed seemed louder than the knock itself, almost accusatory. I approached the door slowly, flashlight in hand, every step measured. My own breathing seemed intrusive, echoing too loudly in the small space. When I looked through the peephole, nothing. Just the faint shimmer of moonlight on the snow-covered ground. And yet I could feel it. Someone or something just beyond the perimeter, waiting, watching. A second knock came, this one softer, almost hesitant. My pulse quickened. I tried to reason it away, maybe another hiker lost in the woods, but the instinct in my gut screamed otherwise. The air itself seemed to press against me, the kind of suffocating, silent tension that fills a room before something terrible is revealed. I forced my hands to remain steady as I unlocked the door. The porch was empty. Only the snow, undisturbed except for my own footprints and the towering pines, casting long, dark shadows across the clearing. I scanned the area carefully, flashlights sweeping left and right, every crack of the old wood underfoot amplified. Nothing. My fingers tightened around the door handle, and I swore I could feel eyes, just at the edge of my vision, shifting with every subtle movement of the trees. I stepped outside, forcing myself forward. The forest was quiet, but the kind of quiet that felt deliberate, expectant. My flashlight caught something, a figure perhaps standing just beyond the tree line. I blinked and it vanished. My mind struggled to grasp it, trying to rationalize what I had seen. Shadows playing tricks, exhaustion, paranoia. Yet the feeling of being watched, of something following, intensified with every heartbeat. The knock returned, muffled, coming from inside the cabin. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. There was no one there, not physically, but the sound had come from somewhere impossible. The cabin itself seemed to breathe, responding to my fear, twisting reality. I felt it then. The presence I had sensed all along was active, aware, and patient. I searched the cabin, moving from room to room. The furniture sat untouched, the fireplace cold, and the newspaper clippings still spread across the table, yellowed with age. Nothing had moved, yet I couldn't shake the certainty that something had just passed through, leaving a weight in the air that pressed against my chest. The whispers returned, faint but unmistakable, curling around my thoughts like smoke. I could almost hear a voice, not speaking words but communicating intent, a quiet insistence that I noticed. In the corner of the living room, I saw a shadow detach itself from the wall. It stretched, elongated, impossibly tall, yet intangible. I pointed the flashlight, but the beam passed through it like mist. My stomach dropped. This was not a trick of the mind or fatigue or the wind. The cabin had a memory, and it was showing me something. Something it had kept hidden for years. I felt compelled to follow the shadow, moving toward the small room I had avoided since my first night here. The locked room. Its door, once solid and impenetrable, now seemed to pulse subtly, as if breathing. My hand hovered over the handle. I hesitated. Every rational thought screamed to leave, to run from the cabin, to escape the suffocating awareness that had crept into every corner of my mind. Yet something stronger pushed me forward, a curiosity I could not resist. Inside, the room was unchanged from before. Dust hung in the air, particles drifting in the flashlight's glow, and the strange markings on the walls seemed to shimmer faintly, shifting with my gaze. The shadow lingered, hovering near the center, undefined, waiting. And then I noticed the floorboards. One plank slightly raised, catching the light differently. A hidden compartment, a secret left untouched. My hand trembled as I lifted it, revealing a small, dark hollow beneath. Inside, objects, small, personal, intimate, were arranged carefully. Trinkets, scraps of clothing, photographs with faces I did not recognize but somehow felt familiar. I recognized the pattern. The missing hikers, the stories I had read, the whispers threading through the forest itself. It all converged here, collected in this hidden space. And at that moment I understood that the cabin was not just a building. It was a container, a witness, a recorder of everything that had passed through these woods. A sudden chill ran through me, colder than anything outside. The whispering intensified, and I felt movement behind me. Spinning around, I caught a glimpse of a figure. A silhouette, human in shape but impossibly elongated, just at the edge of the light. The air thickened, heavy with anticipation. My chest tightened. My mind wanted to flee, but my legs felt rooted to the floor. And then it spoke, not in words, but a sensation. Recognition, accusation, expectation. The cabin itself seemed alive, communicating through the shadows, through the shift of air, through the whispers that circled endlessly. I realized that the last visitor had not come and gone. That visitor, whoever, whatever it had been, had remained, watching, waiting, and now it had decided I was part of its cycle. I stumbled backward, nearly falling, my flashlight swinging wildly. The shadows writhed, stretching toward me, brushing against my skin like living things. My heart raced, adrenaline spiking, and yet amidst the terror a perverse clarity emerged. I understood that the cabin, the forest, the shadows, they were all extensions of the same presence. They remembered everything and they wanted acknowledgement, wanted me to witness what had transpired before. A faint scraping sound came from the floor above, deliberate and slow. Steps. No heavier, more deliberate. I froze, straining to listen, imagining every possible scenario. The cabin had a hierarchy, I realized, unseen but present, assigning roles, dictating movements. The shadows did not act randomly. They were guided by something older, patient, waiting for the right observer to arrive. I descended to the main room again, trying to shake off the creeping dread, trying to convince myself that leaving was possible. But the door would not yield. The lock, which had been simple hours before, now resisted, as if aware of my intentions. Outside, the snow remained undisturbed, as though the forest itself conspired to hold me here between the walls, in the watchful eyes of the shadows. The whispers grew louder, circling, pressing at the edges of my thoughts. I could almost hear names, fragments of conversations, the voices of those who had passed before me, some terrified, some resigned, some angry. I felt an oppressive weight, the cumulative memory of the cabin settling onto my shoulders. I realized then that it did not merely remember, it judged, and I was under scrutiny. Hours or maybe minutes passed. Time had no meaning here. Every flicker of shadow, every breath of air, every faint sound was amplified, imbued with intent. I could not close my eyes for fear of missing something, and I began to see patterns, the subtle shifts in light, the way shadows aligned with markings on the walls, the rhythm of the whispers. The cabin was alive, aware, and inexorably tied to the forest beyond. Eventually, I sank to the floor, back against the wall, flashlight dimmed, every nerve straining. The whispers softened but never ceased, a constant reminder that the presence had not left, that the cabin had not relinquished its claim. And somewhere deep inside, I knew that this would not end, that the cabin had chosen its witnesses carefully, and I had been added to its ledger. Outside, the forest remained silent, yet I could feel it, the gaze extending beyond the walls, beyond the trees, into every shadow. The cabin had been patient for decades, and it would continue to wait, to observe, to remember. And I realized with a chill that the cycle would continue, that the whispers, the shadows, the presence itself were ongoing, infinite in their patience. I rose slowly, every movement deliberate, and glanced once more at the hollow where the trinkets lay. The faces stared back at me in fragments of photographs, remnants of lives interrupted, each item a testament to those who had entered the cabin before. And I understood, the last visitor was never really gone. They lingered in the memory of the walls, in the echo of the floorboards, in the whispers that would haunt every corner. I retreated to the main room, sliding the door closed, but the sense of eyes on me persisted. The cabin breathed, alive and conscious, and I felt its awareness pressing against my mind. I knew then that leaving would not erase what I had seen, what I had felt. The forest and cabin had claimed my attention, my awareness, and they would not release it lightly. I sat there, flashlight dimmed, staring into the darkness, listening to the whispers curling endlessly through the air. Somewhere beyond the pines, a wind shifted, carrying the subtle echo of movement as if the last visitor had never truly left. And I realized that the story of the cabin, the shadows, the whispers was not over. Not for me, not for anyone who entered. The presence remained, patient, infinite, waiting for the next observer, the next witness, the next soul to acknowledge it. And as sleep finally claimed me in short, restless bursts, I understood that the cabin would continue to watch, to remember, to whisper, long after I had gone, long after any rational explanation could be offered. The last visitor had arrived, and I was no longer alone. The headlights cut a narrow path through the darkness, a ribbon of light on a road that seemed to vanish into nothing. Trees leaned close on either side, black silhouettes against the pale smear of moonlight. I gripped the wheel tighter, not because of the cold, that was nothing, but because the forest seemed to breathe around me, waiting. I knew the stories. Everyone in the nearby town had their versions. travelers who vanished without a trace, cars abandoned at the edge of the pines, headlights still on, engines ticking like a heartbeat that had stopped. Most of it I dismissed as legend. Until tonight, I'd never driven this road after dark alone. The radio hissed with static, broken by an old folk song that seemed warped, too slow, too distorted. I turned the dial. Silence. Just the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle from the trees. My pulse started to rise. Somewhere along this road I felt the forest had a memory. A movement flickered at the edge of my vision, a shadow darting between the trunks. I swerved slightly, heart hammering, but it was gone before I could process it. Nothing, just the road stretching ahead, black and empty. Yet the feeling of being watched didn't leave. Every mile seemed longer than the last, every bend deeper, more suffocating. I tried to focus on the rhythm of driving, the tires crunching on gravel, but the forest demanded attention. There was something alive here, something patient. I remembered the warning I'd shrugged off that afternoon. "Don't drive after dark," the old man said. "The woods, they take what they like." I laughed then. Not anymore. A faint reflection caught my eye in the rearview mirror. A pair of headlights far behind me, faint, wavering. I exhaled. Relief. Another traveler, or maybe someone leaving the road. But as I blinked, the lights vanished and the rearview offered only darkness. I shook my head, my mind playing tricks, or not. The road narrowed, bending sharply where trees formed a tunnel. My headlights barely penetrated the darkness, and then a figure appeared, standing in the center of the lane. I slammed the brakes, tires screaming. The car skidded and the figure, impossibly tall, thin, vanished before I could see more. No sound, no movement, nothing but the lingering impression that it had been there and that it had seen me. I stopped on the shoulder, shaking. The engine idled. I tried to laugh it off. Maybe a deer, maybe hallucination. But the road behind me seemed to thrum with quiet intent, the darkness beyond my headlights watching. My phone had no signal. Typical, they said. Out here, deep in the forest, the world outside ceases to exist. I started driving again, slower this time. Every shadow now seemed to twist, as if moving with a purpose. Branches scratched at the windshield. The radio flickered to life, faint voices murmuring, indecipherable, over static. I turned it off, too tense to care about music. The hum of the engine and the crunch of gravel were enough. A curve appeared ahead, sharper than the map suggested. I braked, scanning the roadside. A car abandoned, doors open, headlights off. No driver, no footprints. Only the cold metal and the faint smell of something sour, almost like decay. I swallowed hard. Every story I'd dismissed before came rushing back. People disappear here, and now I was part of the road. I stepped out, heart pounding, and approached the abandoned car. The interior was empty, seats dusted with frost. A bottle of water, half full, left on the passenger side. The driver's side door had been left wide open, swinging slightly in the wind. I leaned closer, trying to find some clue, some rational explanation. Nothing, only silence, thick and oppressive. I climbed back into my car. The headlights caught movement at the edge of the trees. Again, a figure just beyond the tree line, tall, thin, waiting. I blinked. Gone. And then I felt it. The road itself seemed aware of me, bending and twisting, holding secrets I couldn't see, secrets older than the town I had driven through earlier. My hands tightened on the wheel. I tried to reassure myself, it's just a road, just trees, just isolation. But every instinct screamed the opposite. The stories weren't just warnings, they were records. Records of people who had driven too far, too late, alone. People who had been marked, noticed, and taken. I pressed the accelerator, desperate to leave the stretch behind, but the road felt longer than it should have been. Each mile repeated the last. Headlights flickered, shadows deepened. And then a sound, soft, deliberate, footsteps crunching on gravel behind me. I checked the rearview again. Nothing. Yet the sound persisted, growing closer, then fading, always at the edge of hearing. I wanted to stop. I wanted to get out. But some part of me, curiosity, fear, something darker, pushed me forward. The footsteps began again, irregular this time, not matching the rhythm of any car, any animal. Something was walking the road, invisible, following, patient. And I realized I had no control. The forest dictated movement. It guided the night. A curve brought me near an old bridge, wooden planks groaning under the weight of my car. I slowed, peering into the black water below. Reflections rippled, but no moonlight, just darkness, almost solid. I thought I saw movement beneath the surface, shapes shifting with intent. My breath came quick, my pulse in my ears. Was it a trick of the light, or something waiting, always waiting under the bridge? Headlights swept the trees beyond, and I caught it, a flash of pale, human-like skin among the pines. Then gone. Only the rustle of leaves. My vision kept catching shapes, fleeting, impossible to focus on. And the whispers began. Not voices, not words. Hints of murmurs, soft and pressing, threading into my thoughts, urging me to look, to follow, to notice. I passed another turn. More abandoned vehicles, some with doors open, some with personal items left behind, jackets, hats, even a backpack, half buried in snow. I recognized a pattern. The road itself was a repository. Every disappearance left a mark, a trace, a memory. And I was being added to the record, my presence noted, my fear cataloged. The footsteps returned, synchronized with my heartbeat. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, the wind, anything. But deep down, I knew better. Something walked this road, unseen yet fully aware, watching me, testing me, measuring. The thought of turning around, of returning to the town, offered no comfort. The forest would not release me so easily. I drove on, gripping the wheel until my knuckles were white. The whispers grew louder, circling, teasing, almost forming words I couldn't comprehend. And then I noticed the trees were shifting subtly, leaning closer with each mile, branches forming shapes that mimicked the human form, as if they too had been touched by whatever haunted this road. The final stretch appeared, a curve so sharp I almost didn't see it until I was upon it. And there, standing in the center, unmistakable this time, a figure blocking the path. Pale, elongated, impossible in its stillness, with eyes that seemed hollow but knowing. I froze. Every instinct screamed to swerve, to flee, but the road refused. The creature did not move. It simply waited, patient, immortal. The engine stuttered. I glanced at the dashboard. Lights flickered. The radio crackled with static, almost forming a whisper. "Stay!" I jerked the wheel. Tires screamed. The car skidded off the road, snow spraying, trees rushing past like specters. My heart hammered, chest tight, mind spinning. And then the road straightened, quiet. The figure was gone. The forest fell silent. I didn't stop, not until the lights of town appeared in the distance. And yet, even there, I could feel it. The eyes, the whispers, the record of the night etched into something older than the asphalt, older than the trees, older than me. The road had noticed. The road remembered. And it would always be waiting for the next driver. Even now, days later, I feel it when I sleep. The rustle at the edge of consciousness, the whispers curling around my thoughts. And I know, no matter where I go, that stretch of forest will never forget. That night I became part of its memory. And some part of me still walks the road, just beyond the headlights, just out of reach, just waiting. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, a wall of black trunks on either side, broken only by the thin gray smear of the moon above. My headlights cut a narrow swath through the darkness, illuminating the gravel road, and then nothing. Nothing but the silent pines, the distant rustle of wind, and the weight of being utterly alone. And then I saw it, a car parked crooked at the side of the road. Headlights off, doors slightly ajar, windows fogged over with condensation. I slowed, heart thumping. It wasn't the kind of thing you ignored. Not here, not after the stories. I pulled closer, peering inside. The interior was empty, seats unbuckled, a jacket draped over the passenger seat. I stepped out onto the cold gravel, the night air sharp in my lungs. The tires were clean, no dust from the road, almost as if it had been abandoned recently. But there were no footprints, no signs of a struggle, just stillness. I ran a hand along the hood. Frost, nothing more. But the scent lingered, a faint metallic tang like blood mixed with wet earth. I froze. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but my stomach clenched. Something had happened here, something I couldn't see. A rustle behind me. I spun, but nothing. Only the forest swaying, whispering in the wind. I told myself it was just animals. Deer, maybe, or the wind brushing against fallen branches. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The feeling that the road itself had eyes. I stepped back into my car, doors locking with a click that sounded far too loud in the silence. As I drove on, I noticed another car just up the bend. Same story, doors open, lights out, abandoned, nothing else. A pattern forming. And then another, each more unsettling than the last. Jackets left draped over seats, scarves hanging from mirrors, water bottles half empty. All abandoned, all silent, all waiting. I tried to rationalize. Maybe these were hikers, lost, stranded in the cold. But some of the vehicles had been there long enough for frost to form on the windshields, thick enough that they looked like ghostly eyes staring at me. And not all of them were small. Some were trucks, older models, rusted. People didn't leave these by accident. One car caught my attention. A red sedan, doors wide open, and something inside caught the weak glow of my headlights. A notebook lying on the passenger seat, pages fluttering in the wind. I stopped, engine ticking. Every instinct screamed to leave, but I needed answers. I opened the door carefully, heart hammering. The notebook was filled with handwriting, notes, dates, and times, locations marked along the very road I was driving. Names, too. Some crossed out, some circled. And then a drawing. A crude map showing the forest, roads, and an X near the curve ahead. A shiver ran down my spine. Someone had been tracking this road, this forest, for a long time. And judging by the notebook, what happened to the people who disappeared wasn't random. I didn't hear the footsteps at first. Not until a crunch of gravel, faint, deliberate, I looked up. Nothing. The car was still empty, but my skin prickled like a cold hand brushing across the back of my neck. I slammed the door, scrambling back into my car, locking it. The headlights caught a glimpse of movement in the trees, just at the edge of vision, pale. Fleeting, I blinked. Gone. But the feeling remained thick, like the forest had leaned closer, curious, hungry. I drove on, slower now, scanning the roadside. Another abandoned car appeared, its windshield shattered, hood dented like it had hit something or someone. Inside, the interior was coated with a dark stain, almost dried, almost forgotten. My stomach turned. I looked away, tried to focus on the road. I had to keep moving. Had to escape the sense that I was being cataloged, counted, noted. And then the whispering began. Faint at first, almost a hiss like leaves rubbing together, but different, almost human. Words I couldn't make out. I pressed the accelerator, heart in my throat. The whispers followed. The footsteps returned, echoing behind the car. But every time I glanced into the rear view, nothing. Only trees, dark and endless. At the next bend, a truck leaned to the side, tires sunken into the soft shoulder. Its doors were open, windows fogged. I could see remnants of a meal, half-eaten sandwiches, a thermos tipped over. Dust and frost layered over everything. It looked like someone had just left. And yet the longer I stared, the more it seemed wrong. Too clean, too staged. I felt a tug in my chest, a warning I couldn't ignore. This wasn't random, not wildlife, not accidents. Someone or something was guiding the scene, choosing what to leave behind, what to erase. And they were patient, waiting, watching, always waiting. My headlights caught a figure this time, standing just beyond a cluster of trees, head tilted, motionless. I couldn't tell if it was human. I couldn't tell if it was watching me or the road itself. I held my breath, and then it vanished, or maybe I blinked. I wasn't sure. The abandoned cars continued, each more unsettling than the last. I noticed subtle forensic clues I couldn't ignore. Scratches on doors, scuff marks in the gravel, faint streaks of something darker than dirt. Every vehicle told a story of someone who had driven too far, arrived too late, and never returned. The road twisted and I saw a small hatchback lodged under the pines, half buried in snow. Its windows were shattered, interior bloodied. Something had fought, struggled. Something had left. Or hadn't. My chest tightened. I couldn't stop looking. And then I noticed the pattern, each vehicle closer to the center of the forest, deeper, like breadcrumbs leading somewhere I didn't want to go. A sudden gust of wind slammed the doors of one car down the road. The sound echoed like a scream. My head snapped toward it, headlights catching movement again. Faint figures among the trees, darting from shadow to shadow, too quick to identify. I swallowed hard, knuckles white on the wheel. The road itself seemed alive, guiding me, hurting me. I tried to focus on a rational exit, turn back, drive faster, but the road didn't allow it. Curves doubled back unexpectedly, trees leaned closer, shadows shifting like spectators. And the whispers grew louder, voices overlapping, pressing against my thoughts. Names, dates, warnings, things I couldn't understand but felt bone deep. I passed a vehicle that made me stop cold. A motorcycle, upright, engine cold. On the seat, a helmet. I picked it up. There was a faint fingerprint smudge pressed deeply into the surface. Someone had touched it recently, or someone was meant to think so. I set it down quickly, the weight of being noticed pressing against me. The abandoned cars kept coming. Sedans, trucks, hatchbacks, each telling a story of disappearance, of struggle, of lives paused in the forest's memory. And in every shadow I saw movement, too quick, too fluid, too intentional. Eyes, perhaps, or imagination. My mind couldn't tell anymore. Finally, the road narrowed. No more cars. Only trees pressing in on either side, branches scraping metal, rustling with secrets. And in the distance I saw the curve marked in the notebook. The same X. My hand shook. The forest itself seemed to pulse, waiting for me to arrive, waiting to see if I too would leave a mark or vanish completely. The whispers formed words I couldn't understand, pressing at the edges of my mind. I realized something then. The cars were warnings, records, markers, each abandonment a breadcrumb of survival or failure. And now I was being added to the tally, my presence noticed, catalogued, remembered. I gripped the wheel, trying to steady my breath, steady my thoughts. The curve ahead loomed, and for the first time I didn't know if I would drive through, if the forest would allow it, if I would leave this night with only the memory of abandoned vehicles or something far worse. Even now I can't forget the feeling of being watched, catalogued, counted. The vehicles, the subtle traces of presence, they weren't random. They never were. And the forest waits, patient and eternal, marking each traveler who dares to drive its road alone. I know that now. I know it better than I want to. And somewhere ahead, beyond the headlights, the next vehicle waits. Or maybe it already exists, waiting for me, waiting for someone else, waiting for the forest to notice again. The road narrowed as the trees closed in on either side, shadows pressing against my headlights like they wanted to push me off the path. Every curve seemed longer than the last, as if the forest had stretched itself while I wasn't looking. The abandoned cars faded behind me, but the sense of something following didn't. It was there in the hush between rustling leaves, in the sudden chill that made my breath visible in the cab. Then I heard it, a faint cry, almost human, soft and broken. My chest tightened. I told myself it was the wind, the way it moved through branches and hollow trunks, but it was. There was a rhythm, a desperation, a plea I couldn't ignore. I slowed. Headlights scanned the roadside, bouncing off the moss and tangled roots. Nothing. Only the dark, waiting. And then a footstep or the echo of one, somewhere to the right, behind the trees. I turned fully, heart hammering, and caught a fleeting glimpse of movement, slender, pale, disappearing as quickly as it appeared. I swallowed hard, gripping the wheel. Every instinct screamed to drive, to leave this place. And yet I couldn't. The cries came again, soft, coaxing, almost guiding me forward. I realized the road itself felt alive, pulsing under the tires, stretching endlessly. Each mile felt the same, yet unfamiliar. I had been driving for hours or minutes. I didn't know anymore. Time had lost its shape here. Another sound joined the cries, footsteps, slow and deliberate, padding on gravel. Not far, but not close. To my left, a shadow shifted between the trunks. It had no clear form, just a silhouette that seemed to breathe with the forest. My stomach twisted. I wasn't alone. I hadn't been alone since the first abandoned car. I tried to focus on the road ahead. My headlights caught an old truck wedged against a tree. Frost-coated windows, a dented fender, but inside I saw movement. A head turned slowly toward me, though the cab was empty. I blinked. The headlights reflected only frost, nothing alive, but the sensation lingered, the certainty that something unseen was watching, waiting. The cries grew louder, a child's voice, an adult. I couldn't tell, it was both and neither. Faint footsteps followed in perfect sync, a rhythm matching my pulse. I glanced into the rearview mirror. Trees, just trees, nothing else. And yet I felt a gaze there, pressing into my back through the leather seat. I wanted to escape, to turn around, to stop. But every turn led me back to the same stretch of road, the same line of pines. It was endless. The forest had me. It didn't care about speed or skill or reason. I wasn't driving, I was being carried, a puppet guided by some invisible hand. A figure appeared ahead, small, standing in the center of the road. A child, no, too tall, too thin. It turned slowly to face me, eyes pale, almost glowing. I froze, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles whitened. And then it was gone, as though it had never been there, leaving only the cold night and the sound of my own shallow breaths. I tried to focus on rationality. Maybe I was hallucinating, exhausted, lost in the monotony of dark trees and gravel. But the cries persisted. Each one carried a memory I didn't have, a pain I didn't recognize but could feel deep in my bones. The footsteps shifted closer, now to the side, matching my pace, but always just out of view. A car, abandoned, appeared in the beam of my headlights. Doors open, interior frozen in time. But there was something new, faint scratches on the hood, as if someone had tried to claw their way inside. I stopped, heart in my throat. My reflection shimmered on the window, and for a moment it didn't match me. Eyes wider, mouth drawn tight, a shadow where my face should have been. I slammed the door, locked it. Engine roared, tires spinning gravel, but still the forest pressed in. The cries became words, murmurs I almost understood. Names, pleas, warnings. Each carried a weight, a story. I was becoming part of it. Somehow, unavoidably, I was being folded into the history of this road. The road curved again. Another shadow flitted between trees. I could feel it watching, measuring. And then faintly I heard laughter. Not cheerful, not human, hollow, distant, echoing. It bounced off the trunks, through the branches, brushing against my thoughts. I imagined all the abandoned cars behind me, each one a vessel for a lost story, each one an echo of someone else trapped, someone else who had driven too far. I glanced to the rear view. Movement, too fast, too purposeful, my breath hitched. I slammed my eyes shut for a moment, counting heartbeats. When I opened them, nothing. And yet I knew it had been there. I knew it always was and would always be. The forest wasn't passive. It wasn't forgiving. It watched, it remembered, it waited. Another cry pierced the night, closer this time, urgent, desperate. I realized I could no longer distinguish direction. Ahead, behind, left, right, it all blended into a single pressing presence. The road itself seemed to whisper, as if inviting me to follow, promising answers, threatening consequences. I passed a cluster of abandoned vehicles lined up like sentinels. Sedans, trucks, hatchbacks, some with frost, some with scratches, all silent witnesses. I realized the pattern now. Each one marked a step deeper into the forest, deeper into something I didn't understand. And I was next. The footsteps accelerated, though I hadn't increased speed. They weren't random anymore, they had intent. I caught glimpses, pale limbs darting just beyond the reach of my headlights. A jacket here, a boot there, left behind like a breadcrumb trail of despair. I could see the forest shifting, shadows bending to the rhythm of movement I couldn't track. I wanted to stop, to get out, to run, but the road didn't allow it. Curves doubled back on themselves, trees leaning closer, shadows stretching unnaturally. The cries were all around me now, overlapping, endless. Names, laughs, pleas, all folding into one another. I realized I would never know where they ended or I began. A figure appeared at the edge of the road, leaning against a tree. Pale, faceless, I couldn't move. It raised an arm pointing down the curve and I felt compelled, drawn forward. I accelerated despite every instinct screaming no. The whispers surged, forming words I almost understood. Follow, stay, leave, stay. The road twisted again endlessly. Another abandoned car appeared, interior upturned, frost thick on the glass. Inside, a faint movement, a shadow flickering across the seats. I glanced quickly away, tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself I was imagining. But every sense screamed the truth. Someone or something was orchestrating this. Watching, waiting. The cries intensified. Footsteps surrounded the car now, though I couldn't see them. Panic gripped me. I pounded the wheel, trying to focus on the path, but the road was no longer a path. It was a spiral pulling me deeper. And I understood I would not leave. Not yet. Not without joining the chorus of echoes. A flash of movement caught my eye, a figure darting from tree to tree. Pale, silent. Watching. I realized I had been driving into a trap, or perhaps toward a truth I wasn't ready to face. The whispers were louder now, insistent, almost pleading. Names repeated, dates, places. I heard my own name whispered somewhere between the pines. I gripped the wheel tighter, knuckles white. The cries formed a pattern. I tried to match it, to make sense, but it was impossible. I was trapped in sound, in memory, in a space the forest controlled. The road stretched on, endless, a spiral of forgotten travelers and abandoned cars, of names I would never know and lives I couldn't save. And then it hit me. The echoes weren't behind me. They were inside me. Every heartbeat, every shallow breath, every nervous glance at the shadows, I carried them now. The forest had marked me. I would never truly leave. I would drive here, see, and feel as long as I survived. And when I stopped, when I finally slowed, the forest would claim me fully, adding me to its collection. One more voice in the endless, unrelenting chorus. The cries rose again, closer, overlapping with footsteps, and I drove. I don't know how far, I don't know how long. The road, the shadows, the abandoned vehicles, they all merged into one endless path. And somewhere just ahead I heard it. A whisper not my own, distinct, deliberate, calling my name. A promise, a threat, an invitation. The road went on, the echoes followed, and I realized I would never be alone again. I pushed the rusted gate open and it groaned like a warning. The mill loomed ahead, hulking and hollow, its brick walls cracked and mottled with years of rain and neglect. Every step toward it felt heavier, as though the ground itself resisted my presence. The windows stared like dark, empty eyes, some shattered, others blackened with soot and grime. I should have turned back, but I couldn't. Something, call it curiosity or stubbornness, pulled me in. Inside, the air was thick and stale. Dust motes danced in the faint shafts of light breaking through broken windows. I coughed, my voice sharp in the silence. The floorboards creaked beneath my boots, announcing my movement to a building that hadn't heard a human step in decades. I paused at the doorway, listening. Nothing. Only the wind, whispering through jagged holes in the roof. The machinery still stood, twisted and frozen in mid-operation. Gears caked with rust, belts frayed and sagging, levers frozen like claws reaching for some unseen prey. I ran my fingers along the cold metal. It vibrated faintly under my touch, almost alive. My pulse quickened. Who had worked here? What had happened that left all of this abandoned, frozen in a moment of chaos? I moved deeper, the floorboards groaning in protest. Rooms opened up on either side. One a storage area, crates toppled and rotted. Another an office, papers yellowed and brittle, shelves sagging under the weight of forgotten ledgers. My eyes caught a stain on the floorboards, a dark, irregular smear, dried but unmistakable. Blood, old but unmistakable. I swallowed hard. My instincts screamed to leave, but the building seemed to shift, guiding me forward. In the shadows of the office, I found a door slightly ajar. Beyond it, a staircase spiraled down into darkness. The smell hit me before I saw it. Damp earth decay, something metallic beneath it. I hesitated. My hand hovered over the banister, trembling. Then, as if the building breathed, I descended. The basement was colder, the walls slick with moisture. My flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating broken crates, puddles of stagnant water, and tools scattered as if dropped in panic. I stepped carefully, boots sliding slightly on the wet floor. Then I saw it. Scratches on the walls, deep and frantic, as if someone had clawed their way out, or in. They trailed across the stone and vanished into the blackness beyond my light. I followed them, every step echoed. I imagined footsteps behind me, always just beyond my hearing. The air grew heavier, thick with something I couldn't name. I reached the end of the corridor and froze. In the corner, a machine, larger than any I'd seen upstairs, loomed like a monster. Its blades were rusted and jagged, coated with layers of dust and something darker. A faint smear along the edge caught the light. Old blood, I told myself, but why did it make my stomach turn so violently? A sudden sound, metal scraping against metal, made me jump. My flashlight flickered, then steadied. Nothing moved, yet the air thrummed with presence. I told myself it was rats, maybe the wind. But the sound repeated, closer, deliberate, almost deliberate. I realized I wasn't alone. Someone or something had been here, still here. I moved on, heart hammering. The hallway opened into a larger chamber, a central workspace. Machinery hung from the ceiling like iron skeletons. Chains swayed slightly, though no breeze stirred. My skin prickled. The floor was littered with broken tools, twisted remnants of something once functional, now grotesque. And then I saw them, marks etched into the concrete, words or symbols, I couldn't tell. They seemed carved with purpose, a message left for anyone who dared enter. I crouched to examine the symbols, running a finger along the grooves. Cold, sharp edges cut into my skin. The shapes didn't make sense, but the intent was clear. Warning. A story of pain, of anger, maybe revenge. I shivered. My mind raced. What had happened here? Who had suffered? And why did it feel like the building itself resented my intrusion? I moved toward the far end, where a staircase spiraled up to a loft. The air grew warmer, mustier. Light from the broken roof illuminated patches of wall, peeling paint, revealing layers beneath, older layers beneath that. Faces seemed to stare back at me from the stains and cracks, mocking, pleading, accusing. I blinked and they vanished. Or did they? My nerves were fraying. The loft was empty, dust covering the floor in thick layers. I stepped carefully, hearing my boots whisper across the boards. Then I noticed something, a collection of photographs pinned to the wall. Faces, dozens of them, eyes wide with fear or shock, each image labeled with a date. The dates spanned decades. Some faces were children, some adults, some blurred, distorted by time. A cold realization hit me. These were the victims. This was the ledger of horror, recorded on walls instead of paper. A sudden creak made me spin around. Shadows shifted. Nothing. But I felt it, a weight pressing from behind, from above, from everywhere at once. The building seemed to hum, alive with memory, with rage. I wanted to flee, to run down the stairs. Out the doors, away from the walls that had watched and remembered. But the more I moved, the more the mill seemed to twist, the corridors longer, the shadows denser. I found a door at the loft's edge. It led to a small room, cramped, its ceiling sagging. Inside, the smell was strongest, metallic, iron-rich, overwhelming. Tools were arranged neatly as if someone had been interrupted mid-use. And in the center, a chair, rusted, blood-stained, as if the last person to sit there had left in a hurry, or perhaps hadn't left at all. I approached, heart in my throat. The floor beneath the chair was darker than the surrounding wood. I crouched, running my hand along the edges. Indentations in the floor, deep, irregular, as though someone had struggled. My mind raced with images, questions I couldn't answer. And then on the wall behind the chair, a single word, stop, scratched deep, desperate, jagged. My stomach churned. A sudden rush of air made the door slam behind me. I jumped. The flashlight flickered violently, casting the room in brief, strobing darkness. I could feel the weight again, closer, almost touching my neck. I spun, but nothing. Just the chair, the walls, the floor, silent and accusing. I swallowed hard, trying to regain control. My flashlight steadied. I scanned the room again. Something caught my eye, another symbol, smaller, hidden in the corner. It looked like a handprint pressed deep into the plaster. Fingers long, thin, unnaturally so. I realized my own hand shook, unconsciously reaching out to touch it. Cold, too cold, and yet familiar, like I'd seen it before in a dream I didn't remember having. I stumbled backward, tripping over a floorboard. The room seemed to close in, shadows stretching toward me. Whispers tickled my ears, indistinct, garbled, but urgent. I couldn't understand the words, but I understood the meaning. Leave. Leave now before it's too late. I scrambled to the door, yanking it open. It resisted, groaning like a living thing, then swung free. Back in the loft corridor, I caught my breath. The building was quieter now, but the atmosphere didn't ease. Every step toward the exit felt like crossing a battlefield, each shadow a sentinel. I glanced around, the walls peeling, machinery silent but menacing, photographs starring. Faces watching me leave, accusing, warning, mourning. I stepped down the stairs, each creak echoing in the empty mill. Dust rose with each footfall, swirling in the faint shafts of moonlight. The exit was near, but I could feel the weight of history pressing on me. The air grew colder as I neared the main doors. Outside, the night was still, but the stars seemed dim, obscured by clouds that moved too fast, too purposefully. I pushed the doors open. They protested with a groan, then fell silent. The mill stood behind me, hulking and patient. I didn't look back. I ran, boots pounding gravel, lungs burning, heart thrashing. Yet even as I left, I felt it, the weight, the eyes, the memory of the walls. They had seen me, remembered me, and perhaps they would wait for me to return. And in that moment, I realized some places never forget. The mill, its crumbling walls, its dark corridors, wasn't just abandoned. It was alive with the echoes of those who suffered, who fought, who disappeared. And I had added my own heartbeat to its rhythm, my own presence to its memory. I didn't stop running until the gate had vanished behind a bend in the road. Only then did I allow myself to breathe. But even then, in the quiet of the night, I could still hear it. The faint whisper of wood and metal, calling, reminding, waiting. The mill wasn't done with me, and I knew deep down that I would never be done with it. I returned the next day, drawn by something I couldn't name, an insistence that hummed at the edge of my mind. The morning sun had done little to soften the mill's shadow. Its crumbling walls loomed like jagged teeth, and the gate, bent and rusted, seemed to frown at me. The air was cooler, damp with the night's rain, and the smell hit me before I even stepped inside. Iron decay, something sweet and rotten I couldn't place. Inside, the dust hung heavier than yesterday, clinging to my skin, my clothes, even my thoughts. My flashlight cut through it in narrow beams, illuminating machinery frozen mid-motion like metal carcasses of long-dead beasts. I moved slowly, boots scraping on the boards. Each creak and groan sounded louder than it should, echoing back with a weight that made my chest tight. I reached the office again. The air was thick, almost suffocating. Papers crumbled under my fingertips, but something else caught my eye: rusted tools, nails, and a hammer. The metal was pitted, stained, the color deep and uneven. I crouched, noticing faint streaks along the floorboards. Not dust, blood, dried, blackened, but unmistakable. I traced the trail with my eyes, following it like a map, each mark a silent testament to someone's suffering. The smell grew stronger as I moved down the hall, a coppery tang that seemed to rise from the walls themselves. I covered my nose, but it was futile. Every breath carried it deeper into my lungs, embedding it there. I felt the hairs on my neck stand up. Someone had been here, I thought, maybe more than one someone, and they hadn't left quietly. I found a staircase leading to the basement, the wood slick from moisture. Each step I took felt deliberate, as if the building itself had timed them, counting down to some confrontation. The basement was darker than I remembered, shadows pooling in corners, swallowing my light. Rusted chains hung from the ceiling, swinging slightly even though no breeze moved. The smell here was stronger, metallic and heavy, pressing down on my chest. The floor was littered with tools, wrenches, saws, knives, all coated in rust, some smeared with dark stains. I knelt to examine one, a hand saw. Its edge was jagged not from use but from something violent. I could see imprints in the dust, like fingerprints, though nothing alive had touched this in years. And yet it felt recent. My stomach turned. Was it the building's memory, or had I disturbed something hidden? I followed a trail of droplets along the floor, smaller now, almost microscopic. They led to a corner where the wall had crumbled, exposing rough stone beneath. Something about the light here made the shadows stretch longer, darker. I crouched, my hand brushing against the stone. It was cold, almost wet. The smell was stronger, and I realized it wasn't just old blood. It was the remnants of something more primal, more permanent. A sudden clatter behind me made me spin. My flashlight swung, illuminating nothing. The basement was empty, or at least it should have been. My breath caught in my throat. I forced myself forward toward a doorway I hadn't noticed before. The frame was warped, wood splintered. Inside, a small room cramped, lined with shelves of jars. Dust covered, some cracked, revealing dark, unidentifiable contents. I leaned closer. The smell was worse here, pungent and heavy, clinging to the air like a living thing. I stumbled backward, gagging. My hand brushed against a jar, tipping it slightly. It rolled across the floor and shattered. The sound was deafening in the silence, glass cracking, liquid spilling. I recoiled, heart hammering. In the shards, the liquid reflected the beam of my flashlight. Dark red, thick, glistening. Old blood, fresh, I couldn't tell. I noticed the walls were marked, scratched, etched deep into the plaster. Names, dates, symbols I couldn't understand, all overlapping in chaotic layers. Someone had wanted the memory to remain, to speak even decades later. I ran my finger along one set of marks, letters jagged and desperate. The weight of intent pressed down on me, heavy and accusing. I couldn't stay here. And yet I did. I moved deeper into the room. On the floor, footprints muddy, smeared with dark stains. They didn't match mine. Small, adult, uneven. They disappeared under a pile of old machinery, but the air seemed to hold their shape like shadows clinging to memory. The hairs on my arms bristled. I felt eyes on me, though the room was empty. A sudden sound, a creak of metal, faint but deliberate, made my head snap up. I scanned the room. The chains above swayed gently, though the air was still. I backed toward the doorway, flashlight trembling in my grip. The smell intensified, metallic and cloying, suffocating. I realized the building was alive with it, feeding on memory, on presence. And it remembered. I moved out into the main basement floor again. Shadows stretched across the walls, folding over the machinery, over the bloodstains and rusted tools. I noticed another mark on the wall, this one deeper, carved with force. A handprint, wide, long fingers splayed. My own hand shook as I compared it. Not mine. Too large, too deliberate. The building's warning, I thought, leave. I tried to shake it off, forcing myself to inspect the machinery. A large press, its surface pitted with rust, bore stains along the edges. Dried but unmistakable, I crouched to examine it. The smell was strongest here, clinging to my clothes, my skin. I swallowed hard. Someone had been hurt here badly. I could feel it, lingering, imprinting itself onto the air. Footsteps echoed behind me. Quick, soft, deliberate. My pulse spiked. I spun, flashlight swinging wildly. Nothing. Only shadows, thick and twisted. I told myself it was the building, reacting to intrusion, but the instinct in my gut said otherwise. I wasn't alone. I moved toward the staircase, boots sliding slightly on the wet floor. The air was dense, humid, smelling of rust and decay, thick with memory. Every step seemed to stretch time, making the descent longer than it should be. I reached the bottom, heart pounding. The doorway to the far corner beckoned. A small room, door hanging loose on its hinges. Inside, the smell hit me full force, iron, rot, and something darker. Tools arranged neatly, almost ritualistic. And in the center, a chair, rusted, stained. I approached, hand trembling. The floor beneath it was darker, worn away as though someone had struggled there. And then I noticed scratches along the edges of the chair legs, deep, desperate, violent. My breath caught. A whisper brushed my ear. I froze. I wasn't sure if it was real or imagined. The air pressed against me, thick and heavy, smelling of rust and blood. I could feel it behind me, the weight of eyes, of memory. The chair, the stains, the scratches, they weren't just reminders. They were warnings, and maybe invitations. I backed out slowly, tripping over debris. My flashlight illuminated the walls, more handprints, symbols, letters. Each mark screamed for attention, each scar of memory pressed against my mind. I stumbled toward the stairs. The basement seemed to stretch, corridors twisting slightly, shadows folding. I didn't understand. The building had changed while I wasn't looking. Finally, I reached the upper floor. Light from broken windows cut through the dust in thin beams. My lungs burned from the basement air. I could hear the wind outside, but also something else, low, almost imperceptible. A hum, a vibration, memory pressing alive. I paused, listening. It felt like the building was sighing, exhaling decades of violence and pain. I exited through the front doors, leaving the basement, the chair, the handprints, the blood and rust behind. The air outside was fresher, colder, but the memory clung to me. I could still smell the iron in the air. The building had marked me. Its history, its crimes, its echoes, they followed me, invisible but insistent. Even as I walked back to the gate, the wind seemed to carry whispers, faint but persistent. The mill wasn't abandoned in the way I thought. It remembered, and it was patient. I glanced back once. The windows stared like hollow eyes, the roof jagged and broken. I felt it then, undeniable, like a pulse through the ground beneath my feet. The building had watched me, and it would wait, for me or someone else, maybe for both. I walked away, boots crunching on gravel, but the rusted tools, the bloodstains, the handprints, they weren't just memories of the past. They were alive, waiting, patient, watching. And I knew, as the sun rose behind the trees, that the mill would never let its story end. I didn't plan to go back, not really, but something tugged at the edges of my mind, an itch I couldn't scratch, a voice that whispered through my sleep. When I pushed open the mill's door, it groaned like a living thing, dragging years of dust and secrets with it. The sunlight filtered in weakly through the broken windows, cutting the darkness into thin, trembling slices. The air smelled of rust, old blood, and something else I couldn't name. Sweet, almost like rotting sugar. It clung to my clothes, my hair, even my thoughts. I swallowed hard and stepped inside. The floorboards moaned beneath my weight, protesting, echoing back at me like the building itself was alive, listening. I switched on my flashlight, letting the beam sweep across the machinery. Shadows clung to the corners, deep and impossible, stretching and twisting. And then I saw it, a flicker just at the edge of my vision. A figure, faint, transparent, standing near the far wall. I blinked. Nothing, my heart raced. I told myself it was my imagination, the dust catching the light. But the feeling didn't go away. I felt eyes on me. I moved closer to the press, my boots scraping across the floor. Shadows shifted with every step. Another figure appeared, hunched, standing by the rusted chains hanging from the ceiling. Its form was indistinct, almost like smoke shaped itself into a person. I held my breath. It didn't move, didn't blink, just existed, watching. The whispers started then, faint, almost drowned in the hum of the mill, like distant voices echoing through a tunnel. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone, pleading, angry, broken, made my stomach twist. I pressed my hand against a machine, grounding myself, trying to separate reality from hallucination. But the figures didn't vanish. They multiplied, flickering in and out, corners of rooms between broken machinery, behind the shelves of jars I hadn't dared to enter again. One of them stepped forward, or at least I thought it did. A shadow stretched, long and crooked, moving unnaturally. I could feel its gaze burning into me. I took a shaky step back. My flashlight caught the glint of eyes, or something like eyes, two small points of brightness in the darkness. I swallowed. My voice caught when I whispered, "Who's there?" Silence, except for the hum. The building seemed to breathe, to exhale decades of violence and fear. I stepped forward, compelled. There was a desk in the corner, papers scattered, some covered in dust, some stained dark. I picked up one. Letters scratched into the page, hurried and desperate. Names, dates, pleas, and a mark I recognized, a handprint smeared in the same dried blood I'd seen before. The whispers grew louder. Not words anymore, just voices layering over each other. Anger, sadness, fear. They weren't asking for help. They weren't warning me. They were trapped. They had never left. My chest tightened. I could feel the history of this place pressing down on me, filling the room, pressing into the air I breathed. I turned, flashlight shaking. A figure stood at the doorway of the small room I had found before. Taller than the others, solid in shape, yet somehow transparent. It didn't move toward me, didn't speak, but I felt its presence in every nerve ending. I took another step and it was gone. Just a shadow now, merging with the darkness, flickering like a dying flame. I moved through the mill slowly, each step deliberate, careful. My flashlight illuminated jars on the shelves, and in one corner I noticed a faint movement. A hand, a shoulder. It disappeared when I blinked, but the smell, thick and metallic, told me I hadn't imagined it. I felt nausea rise, but curiosity pushed me onward. Each corner I turned, each shadow that flickered made me more certain. The building held more than memories. It held them, restless, unfinished, furious. I reached the basement again. The steps groaned under me. The air was colder here, heavier. Shadows pooled at the edges, deeper than the light could reach. And there on the floor, marks in the dust. Footprints, small and large, human and not. They led to the same corner where the chains hung, swaying without wind. My hand brushed one. Cold, wet, not water. I shivered, pulling it back. A whisper brushed my ear. I spun. Nothing. My flashlight caught movement at the far end. A figure crouched by the wall, almost blending into the shadows. Another figure near the stairs and another behind the press. I counted 4, then 5, but when I blinked, 6. They were everywhere and nowhere. Watching, waiting, I wanted to leave, run, but my legs were rooted, compelled, drawn into the memory of the building, into the lives it had swallowed. I remembered the jars. I moved toward them, hands trembling. Some were cracked, some sealed tight. I leaned closer to one, and my reflection shimmered alongside something else. A face, pale, staring back at me from the liquid inside. Not alive, not dead, but somewhere in between. I stumbled back, heart hammering. The whispers rose to a chorus, unintelligible, unbearable. I pressed myself against a wall, trying to breathe, trying to separate the living from the dead. And then I heard footsteps. Not mine. Quick, deliberate. They echoed from above, from below, from all around. I froze. They stopped. The whispers paused. Silence, heavy and full, hung over the basement. I forced a step forward, and the whispers returned, louder now, closer, pressing against my skull. I stumbled back, nearly falling over a rusted tool. And there, in the shadows at the far end, a figure moved. Faster this time, fluid, almost gliding. Its eyes, or what I imagined as eyes, locked with mine. I realized then they weren't following me. They weren't trying to scare me. They were trying to tell me something. Something I wasn't meant to understand yet. I climbed the stairs, light shaking. The building seemed alive, walls breathing, machinery creaking in patterns, in rhythm with the whispers. I passed the office, papers fluttering as if caught in an invisible wind. My flashlight caught a glimpse of something on the wall. A set of names, dates, marks. A map of tragedies etched into the building itself. Each name was a life ended too soon. Each mark a story unfinished. I reached the main floor again, where sunlight barely penetrated. Shadows lingered in corners, clinging, stretching. And then I noticed the figures weren't just shadows, they were shapes of people. Not fully formed, edges fraying, dissolving into darkness. I caught movement in one, like a person turning to glance back at me. A man, a woman, I couldn't tell. Their presence was undeniable. And then the sound of a chair scraping across the floor above me. I froze. The building had floors, rooms I hadn't seen. Who or what was moving up there? The whispers shifted, urgent, almost warning. I strained to hear. Footsteps, then silence. My pulse raced. I wanted to call out, but my voice stuck in my throat. I wanted to run, but the building seemed to stretch, corridors elongating, shadows folding, twisting. I took a slow step forward. Another figure appeared by the broken windows, pale, hazy, arms raised slightly as if to plead. I stopped, and in that instant I felt it. The weight of all the lives, all the violence, all the fear trapped here. The mill wasn't just a building. It was a vessel, and I had stepped inside. I left the windows and moved toward the door. Shadows followed, stretching behind me. Figures flickered in corners. I felt a presence at my back, cold, heavy. I dared a glance. A face, pale and featureless, stared at me. Not angry, not sad, just waiting, watching, patient. And I realized they were never leaving. I opened the front door. Light spilled in, cutting through the darkness. The whispers faded slightly, replaced by the rustle of wind in the trees. I stepped outside, boots on gravel. My breath came in harsh gasps. I thought I was free. I thought the building had released me. But I knew it hadn't. I could feel it in my bones, smell it clinging to my clothes. The figures, the shadows, the restless dead, they were still inside, waiting, patient. And maybe, just maybe, they had noticed me. I glanced back. The mill stood quiet yet alive. The broken windows seemed to stare, the jagged roofline sharp like teeth. Shadows pooled in the corners, flickering even in daylight. I took a step back, then another. The sun was higher now, but the mill's darkness seemed endless. And I understood something I didn't want to admit. Leaving didn't mean escape. The stories, the lives trapped in those walls had already marked me. They would follow, whispering, waiting, patient. And as I walked away, the breeze carrying the faintest echoes of movement, I realized the mill's story wasn't over. Not for me. Not for anyone who dared step inside. I didn't want to go back. I told myself that. But the memory of the mill, the way the shadows had leaned toward me, the whispers that had followed me home, it pulled me. I pushed open the gate and it protested, rust gnawing at the hinges, a sound like nails dragging across bone. The air smelled the same as before. Rust, decay, something coppery that clung to my nose and throat. The building sat there as if waiting, unchanged. The broken windows reflected the pale light in jagged shards, casting the floors in irregular patterns like the memories of people trapped inside. I stepped closer, boots crunching on gravel. Every instinct screamed to run, but my legs carried me forward. I told myself it was curiosity. I told myself I could leave at any time. But the moment I entered, I felt it. Time itself had paused here. Dust swirled in the air, caught in the beams of my flashlight. The machinery groaned faintly, but it wasn't a sound of age. It was a sound of memory echoing from a day long gone. I ran my hand along the old conveyor belts, felt the cold metal bite at my fingers. A calendar lay tacked to the wall, pages yellowed and curling. The date stopped decades ago. October 1974. My stomach twisted. The mill hadn't moved forward. I hadn't noticed it the first time, or maybe I hadn't wanted to. But here, everything felt paused, locked in some endless loop of violence. I stepped over a pile of papers. They were reports, notes, descriptions of incidents, names crossed out, lines scribbled over. I traced the ink with my finger. Each mark carried weight, each crossed name left a silence, and then I heard it. A faint whisper, low and uneven. My flashlight trembled. "Help," it said. Not far, not near, somewhere in the building's skin. I froze. My pulse thundered. I moved down the corridor, shadows stretching like long fingers along the walls. One of the rooms had the machinery still intact, belts and gears poised mid-motion, frozen as if the workers had vanished mid-step. I could almost see them, faces pale, hands grasping metal, eyes wide in panic. The thought made me flinch. I leaned closer, shining the light into the gears. Rusted tools lay scattered nearby. Blood stains, faded but unmistakable, marred the floor. And I realized the stories weren't just whispers. They were etched into the walls, the floors, the very air. A door creaked above me, not the wind. Footsteps, slow, deliberate but soft. I held my breath. My light swept across the stairs. Shadows pooled along the steps, deeper than darkness should allow. I told myself it was the echo of my own fear, that the building was playing tricks. But then I saw the silhouette at the top, tall, thin, barely there. I blinked. Nothing. My heart wouldn't slow. I moved forward, compelled. The whispers rose, soft murmurs overlapping each other. Not angry, not pleading, observing, waiting. The room ahead smelled metallic. I entered. A workbench, jars of chemicals long dried, floors marked with spattered stains. I knelt, picking up a small vial, dusty and cracked. Inside, the liquid had darkened over decades, coagulated. I held it to the light. Something shifted in its depth, a face, a hand. My reflection blurred with it. I dropped it. Shattered glass skittered across the floor. The whispers laughed, or maybe they sighed. I couldn't tell. I moved toward the far wall where faded photographs hung. Faces of men and women, young, terrified, frozen mid-motion, smiles caught in fear rather than joy. Each photograph had a name scratched into it, dates, some marked with a red slash, others intact, eyes wide and staring. I traced a finger across one face, a young girl. Something pressed at the back of my mind, a memory I couldn't place. And then I realized she hadn't left. None of them had. The air shifted, colder, heavier. Shadows stretched across the ceiling, elongating unnaturally, crawling like living things. I turned quickly. A figure stood in the corner. A woman, faint and translucent, eyes dark pools. She didn't speak, but I felt her stare piercing. Another figure appeared behind the machinery, tall, bending over, faceless. They weren't moving toward me. They didn't need to. The room itself carried their presence. I stumbled into a hallway I didn't remember. Dust swirled in eddies as I passed. Floorboards groaned, and for a moment I saw dozens of shapes out of the corner of my eye. Faces twisted in anguish. Hands pressed to walls. Feet poised mid-step. And I realized this place had never let go of its past. Not the mill, not the people, not even the air. Every breath I took was filtered through years of fear and blood. I found the office again, papers fluttering. I picked one up. Names, incidents, notes about accidents, arguments, fights that escalated. I read a line and stopped. He never left. My hands shook. The voice echoed in my mind. I dropped the paper. The whispers rose, louder now. Layers of sound pressing against me, filling my skull, bending reality. I backed toward the stairs, desperate to reach the front door. Light spilled faintly from broken windows, weak but real. And then I saw movement in one of them. Shadows turned into figures, crouching, waiting. I froze. I could feel their attention, not hostile, not kind, but absolute, observing, watching. The sun was high now, but the shadows refused to move. I ran a hand along the railing. Cold metal, my breath ragged. A figure appeared at the top of the stairs. I could barely see it. Thin, tall, transparent. Arms raised slightly as if acknowledging me. I blinked. Gone. Another figure in the hallway. Gone. And still the whispers pressed, filling my ears, weaving stories I couldn't untangle. I stumbled through the main hall. Machinery groaned softly, belts poised mid-motion. Rusted tools lay across tables. Blood stains marred the floor, but it wasn't just evidence, it was a warning. The building had preserved everything, paused it in time, kept it like a cage. And I had walked inside. I felt small, insignificant, yet entirely exposed. I found the front door, my hand on the handle, and I paused. The mill behind me seemed to shift. Shadows pooled in broken windows. Figures lingered in corners. I could feel them, feel their lives stretching toward me, grasping at the edges of my mind. I opened the door. Light spilled in, washing over me, but the shadows didn't recede. I stepped onto the gravel outside, my chest heaving. The building stood silent, or as silent as a place filled with centuries of unspoken things could be. I glanced back. Shadows flickered inside, shapes indistinct, watching, waiting. The air smelled the same, thick with memory, rust, and something darker I couldn't name. I wanted to leave. I wanted to believe I had. But the moment I turned my back, the building seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive. Time itself bent around it, refusing to move forward. I realized then that leaving didn't matter. The mill's past wasn't gone. It wasn't trapped inside the walls. It was inside me, waiting, patient, constant. And as I walked down the gravel path, sunlight falling on my shoulders, I felt a whisper brush my ear. Not angry, not urgent, just present. A voice that had waited decades, suspended in this place. "You see us now," it said. I didn't respond, I couldn't, but I knew it was true. I saw them, I felt them. And the mill, locked in time, would never let them, or me, go. I shouldn't have left the road. Not really. But the trailhead called to me like it knew my name, quiet and persistent among the trees. The forest stretched before me, thick and dark, the kind that swallows light and memory in equal measure. I parked the car, engine ticking softly, and listened. Silence answered, but not the calm kind. This was a silence that waited, patient and knowing. The path was narrow, littered with fallen leaves and broken twigs. Each step cracked and whispered beneath my boots. I told myself the hikers had probably gone ahead, maybe a few campers setting up for the night. But something felt off. The air was too still. Even the wind seemed afraid to enter. I tried to shake it, tried to convince myself that shadows were shadows, that the rustle of leaves wasn't a footstep following me. But my own heartbeat made it impossible. I kept moving deeper into the forest, branches clawing at my jacket, leaves brushing my face. The sun was dipping, but the canopy swallowed the light quickly, turning the world into a green-black maze. I passed a fallen log, gnarled like an old skeleton, and something caught my eye. A piece of cloth, frayed and dirt-streaked, tangled in the roots. It looked like a hiker's jacket, but the color was faded and it smelled strange. Metallic, sharp, almost like blood, though I hoped it was. I knelt, ran my fingers over it. No name tags, no familiar scent, just fabric and a memory I didn't want. The path twisted and I noticed footprints pressed into the damp earth. Human but not fresh, weeks, maybe months old. I followed them almost without thinking. The trees seemed taller here, leaning inward, forming a tunnel of green shadows that made me feel smaller, exposed. With each step I felt watched, though I couldn't see anyone. The air carried whispers, faint and uncertain. A laugh maybe, or wind. I couldn't tell, and that uncertainty ate at me. A clearing appeared suddenly. It was small, almost perfectly round, with the ground churned up as if someone or something had been digging. I knelt, examining it. Dirt turned under my fingers easily, but there was no evidence of tools, no clue beyond the earth itself. I felt a prickle at the back of my neck, the sensation that someone was just beyond the edge of the clearing. I turned quickly. Nothing, just the forest and the way it seemed to lean inward, patient and silent. I pressed on. The trees thinned slightly and I could see a stream winding through the underbrush. I knelt to drink, but the water was still unnaturally clear. I caught movement at the edge of my vision, a flash of red or brown, something crouching, waiting. I blinked. Nothing. I looked again, still nothing. But the feeling lingered, coiling in my chest, making me aware of every snap of twig underfoot, every gust of wind, every shadow stretching in impossible angles. I walked along the stream, following its bend, and discovered a campsite. Empty tents, tarps sagging, sleeping bags half unrolled. A lantern lay on its side, glass cracked, wick blackened. I bent down and the smell hit me, smoke, yes, but beneath it something fouler. Something burned before I even realized. Rust, metal, something old and coppery. I shook my head, trying to rationalize it. Maybe the campers had left in a hurry. Maybe it had been months since anyone had set foot here. I tried to convince myself that was enough. And then I saw it. A boot, just one, sticking out from under the tarp. Mud-caked, worn, I reached down, touched it. The leather was stiff, brittle. I tugged gently. The leg followed, thin and lifeless. My stomach twisted, but my curiosity, stupid, dangerous curiosity, won. I pulled the tarp fully away. There was a body beneath it, not recent but not ancient either. The skin had faded, pale and waxy, hair matted. Eyes closed, expression slack as if sleeping. I stumbled back, hands shaking. The forest was silent again, but now it was a silence that pressed against me, heavy and judging. I needed to leave. I knew that. Every instinct screamed it. And yet I kept moving, pushed by some invisible force. Something in me wanted to understand, to see more. The trail wound upward, steep now, roots twisting like veins across the path. I held onto them, pulling myself along. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, as if the forest had decided to watch me walk. And then I heard the first real sound. Footsteps. Not my own. Not from any direction I could identify. They matched mine in speed, but were softer, hesitant. I froze, waited, my breath loud in my own ears. The footsteps stopped when I stopped. I moved again, so did they. Faster now, skidding over roots and rocks. I broke into a run, heart hammering, lungs burning. I didn't look back, I couldn't, but I knew they were there, following, always following. I stumbled into another clearing, and this one was worse. Signs of struggle, trees scarred as if claws or ropes had been dragged across them. Twigs and leaves scattered. A hat torn and hanging from a branch. Blood, dried, dark, crusted. I didn't want to know. I needed to get out. I forced myself to calm my breathing, tried to rationalize, tried to convince myself that the forest was playing tricks. But every instinct screamed otherwise. Every snapped branch, every whisper of wind, every shadow pressed against the edge of my vision reminded me that I was not alone. I stumbled on a fallen tree, hands scraping bark, knees cutting through moss. And then I saw them, figures in the distance, human-like, hunched, unmoving. At first I thought it was just branches, leaves twisted into shapes, but then one turned, head tilted unnaturally, eyes reflecting the dying light. Another moved, slow, jerky, like a puppet on strings. My pulse spiked. I wanted to run, but my legs felt leaden, trapped in wet soil and panic. I forced myself to focus on the trail, the narrow strip of earth ahead. The figures didn't pursue, not yet, but their presence pressed against my mind, invasive, insistent. I heard voices, fragmented as if carried from another time. A laugh here, a scream there, faint but clear. I didn't know if it was memory or warning. I didn't want to know. The path narrowed further and the canopy above thickened until light barely touched the forest floor. I stumbled over roots, nearly falling, catching myself on a tree. And then I noticed something strange, marks on the bark, shallow cuts, symbols perhaps. Not random, intentional. The forest was communicating, leaving traces for those who wandered too far. I traced one with my finger, feeling the old sap sticky beneath my touch. The markings were old, very old, and yet I knew they were meant for me. A sudden rustle, not behind me, not ahead, to the side. I swung my flashlight, catching only darkness, but the rustle persisted, moving closer, faster now. Panic clawed at me. I broke into a sprint, branches whipping my face, leaves blinding me. The figures had vanished, but I knew they hadn't left. The forest itself was alive with them, patient, watching, always waiting. I reached a stream again, water rushing, but it offered no comfort. Shadows pooled along the banks, stretching, twisting. I considered crossing, but the current was too fast, too black. I realized then that the trail was no longer leading me anywhere familiar. The forest had claimed it. Every turn looked the same. Every shadow seemed to pulse with life. I was trapped in a labyrinth that knew me. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time felt fluid, meaningless. The whispers returned, soft now, coaxing. Footsteps echoed around me, closer this time, circling, hesitant. I glimpsed movement, figures flitting between trees, impossible shapes, thin and distorted. My mind raced. I had to leave. But the exit, if there was one, refused to reveal itself. And then I heard a cry. Not human, not animal, but a sound that pierced the night and clawed at my sanity. A footstep behind. Another in front. I spun. Nothing. I spun again, still nothing. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me, layering on top of themselves, carrying names, laughter, panic. I realized then that the forest wasn't empty. It had never been empty. It fed on those who wandered in, those who ignored its warnings. I ran blindly, following instinct more than trail, and stumbled onto another clearing. Moonlight broke through the canopy, revealing more discarded items, packs, jackets, shoes. They looked recent, or they were meant to look recent. I couldn't tell. And then I noticed scratches on the ground, dragging marks as if someone or something had tried to leave in a hurry and hadn't succeeded. I stumbled, hands digging into dirt, and froze. A figure stood across the clearing, tall, thin, silent, no face, just shadow. And then another emerging behind the first. And behind that, a line of them stretching into the darkness, endless. My breath caught. I wanted to scream, but the forest swallowed it. My limbs felt heavy, my mind fogged. Escape was an illusion. I ran again, blindly, desperately, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. And even as I moved, I knew it wouldn't end. The forest had remembered me, had marked me, and the trail that had called to me would never let me go. The whispers followed, echoing through the trees, laughter and cries overlapping, indistinguishable, infinite. I was alone, yet never truly alone. I kept moving, and somewhere ahead I thought I saw the faint glow of a campsite, a tent, a lantern swinging in the breeze. I ran toward it, heart hammering. But the moment I drew close, it vanished. Just empty clearing, moonlight, and the ever-watching shadows. And I realized then, the forest didn't just claim the lost. It made the lost eternal. and perhaps now I was one of them. The forest didn't forgive. Every step I took confirmed that. Broken branches snapped underfoot, but not always where I expected. Some seemed bent just slightly, as if something heavy had pressed against them and then vanished. I froze more than once, convinced I'd see someone or something slipping between the trees, only to find empty shadows. The trail narrowed again, tighter now, the underbrush grabbing at my ankles. Mud churned under my boots, soft and damp, holding impressions that weren't mine. Footprints shallow and uneven, as though someone had struggled to walk. I crouched, leaning close, and realized one was smaller than mine, like a child. The edges were rag smeared. I traced the line with a finger, but it felt wrong. Too precise, too deliberate, my chest tight. I looked around, searching for more. The forest felt thicker here, older, as if it had grown around something it wanted to hide, and it had. Not far off the trail, I spotted a tangle of clothing, mud-streaked, torn at the seams. A scarf, a jacket. The colors had faded under the sun, but the fabric carried a faint, coppery smell. I swallowed hard, knowing what it meant. Someone had been here. Someone hadn't left willingly. The trail twisted, leading me toward a slight depression in the ground, almost like a ditch. I stepped cautiously, and my foot caught something hard. A shoe, scuffed and caked with dirt. I knelt, trying to imagine who had worn it. The laces were frayed, untied, as if they'd been yanked off. No footprints around it, just broken twigs and the faint impression of a struggle. My stomach churned. I pressed onward, every sound amplified. A branch snapped somewhere to my left. I spun. Nothing, but my gut told me it wasn't nothing. The forest was alive with memory. The way leaves rustled, the way light hit a broken tree trunk. It all seemed deliberate, rehearsed, holding me in its gaze. My flashlight flickered briefly. I cursed under my breath. That would have been enough to set me on edge anywhere else, but here it felt like a warning. I came upon a small clearing, half hidden by overgrown ferns. The ground was churned, almost dug up, as if someone or something had tried to claw their way out. I saw a backpack lying on its side. Zipper half open, papers spilling. I approached slowly. Among the scattered items were a notebook, soaked through, pages warped. I picked it up. Faded handwriting, frantic, scribbled in places I couldn't read. One phrase jumped out at me. "They're watching. I can't move, please." I dropped the notebook, heart hammering. I told myself it was old, perhaps left behind by some camper long gone. But the air felt tighter, heavier, as if the forest had exhaled around me. A chill slid down my spine. Something about this place wasn't just abandoned. It was a trap, patient, deliberate, and I had walked right into it. I followed the clearing's edge, trying to keep my bearings. That's when I noticed the trees, not just leaning or twisted, but scarred. Deep gashes in the bark, some vertical, some horizontal. The cuts were too clean to be natural, too deliberate, marks of struggle. Some had dark stains in the grooves, older now, but unmistakable. My stomach turned. I wondered how many had been dragged through here before me, and whether I would be next. The air shifted, a faint rustling behind me. I turned sharply, sweeping the flashlight. Nothing, my mind raced. Was it animals, a trick of the wind? I couldn't trust any of it. The forest seemed to breathe, to pulse with some consciousness just out of reach. Shadows elongated in impossible directions. I moved only to see a patch of disturbed earth where it had been calm seconds before. Footprints, a struggle. My pulse spiked again. I stumbled across a fallen log and paused. The surface was scratched deeply, jagged lines carved into the wood. They looked almost like symbols, but raw, desperate. Someone had fought here, fought to survive, or fought for something darker. The log had moss growing along its sides now, but the marks were sharp, recent in memory if not in time. I shivered, running a finger along the grooves. The texture under my touch made me feel sick. Not just the memory, but the intent. Someone had suffered here. Someone had screamed. A rustle in the underbrush, closer this time. I froze, listening. Leaves crunched in irregular patterns. Soft, deliberate. I wanted to call out. I wanted to run, but my throat had gone dry. I took a tentative step forward, then another. The movement stopped. My breath came loud in my own ears. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that the forest played tricks on the mind, but I knew better. Further along, I found remnants of a tent, collapsed, torn, rusted poles poking into the earth like bones. Inside, the ground was churned as if someone had tried to dig to escape or perhaps to hide. A backpack lay nearby, ripped open, contents strewn. A water bottle dented, a map half burned. I bent to inspect it. Marks on the map indicated the trail I had just come from, and then something else scribbled urgent. Do not follow. You will not return. I froze. Who had written this? Months ago, years, or yesterday? My heart raced. The air felt suffocating. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, leave, never come back. But part of me wanted to see more, to understand the story the forest was telling, piece by piece. I hated that I felt that curiosity, but it held me like chains. Branches snapped to my left. I swung the flashlight again. A flash of movement. No shape I could recognize, just something sliding, fluid, watching. I took a step back. My mind conjured shapes in the shadows, figures hunched, faces pale, eyes wide and unblinking. The forest seemed to laugh silently, a slow, mocking acknowledgement of my trespass. I pressed forward again, every step deliberate. More signs of struggle, flattened ferns, trampled undergrowth, scattered personal belongings. A water bottle dented, a scarf torn. Each item a fragment of someone's story, someone who had vanished here, someone whose fear still lingered. I touched the scarf lightly. The texture was familiar, human, warm once, I imagined, before the forest took it. Time became meaningless. Every clearing, every hollow in the trees, every slight rustle kept me on edge. I realized the path itself seemed to curve back on itself. I recognized landmarks I hadn't passed yet, or at least thought I hadn't. The forest was rewriting itself around me. Every mark of struggle, every abandoned item, every scarred tree pointed me deeper into its maze. And then I saw it, a shallow depression, a small pit where earth had been upturned. Inside, fragments of a backpack, a cracked flashlight, a boot, too many of the same kind, layered as if left by different people, different tragedies. I felt a wave of nausea. I touched a piece of fabric, damp, cold, human. I didn't want to know. The shadows shifted. I sensed eyes on me, invisible yet certain. Whispered breaths, or my imagination. The forest had made me paranoid, yes, but some instinct told me this was real. Movement at the edge of my vision. I snapped the flashlight around. Nothing. But I knew they were there, always there, watching, waiting. I pressed on, weaving through the trees, following the signs, following the story the forest was telling in pieces. Each fragment, a shoe, a jacket, a piece of paper, made the presence more tangible. The past wasn't gone here. It lingered in the soil, in the moss, in the broken branches, in the rusted tent poles. The forest had memory, and it was showing me. Eventually, I stumbled onto another clearing. The signs of struggle were heavier here. Deep gouges in the earth, trampled ferns, a backpack with nothing inside. I realized then that I was walking among echoes. Echoes of fear, desperation, of people who had tried and failed. And as I stood there trying to breathe, I heard it. A faint rustle, a low groan, or maybe a whisper. I couldn't tell. My mind was fraying. I ran blindly, following the trail that felt more like a corridor through a living nightmare. Broken branches snapped underfoot, my flashlight flickering. Every step revealed new evidence, new fragments, a scarf caught on a branch, a muddy bootprint disappearing into shadows, a hat lying askew. Each piece whispered, we were here, we struggled, and we vanished. The forest pressed in closer, enclosing me. I realized then that the signs of struggle weren't just warnings. They were invitations, instructions. The forest wanted me to follow, to understand, to see what it did with those who ignored it. And as I ran, I knew I was becoming part of the story too. By the time I reached the next bend, I was breathless, soaked in sweat, my hands trembling. The air smelled of damp earth, of old leaves, of rust and decay. Every step echoed, every shadow seemed to shift in response. And somewhere ahead, deeper in the thicket, I glimpsed a figure, or perhaps it was just another shadow. I couldn't tell. But I knew one thing for certain. The forest was alive with those who had struggled, those who had vanished, and now with me. I didn't see the clearing until I was almost inside it. One moment I was pushing through thick underbrush, branches scratching at my arms, roots tangling my boots. The next, the trees opened up, wide and silent, the air suddenly colder, stiller, heavier. The ground was flat here, almost unnaturally so, and the moss underfoot looked pressed down as if something, or someone, had lain there for a long time. I stopped at the edge, flashlight sweeping across the clearing. Nothing moved, but I could feel it, like the air itself was watching, waiting. My breath came out in short bursts, mist curling in the dim light. Shadows from the trees stretched unnaturally long, almost reaching toward me, trembling like fingers. I swallowed and took a cautious step forward. The floor of the clearing was scattered with fragments, broken branches, flattened leaves, half-buried stones. Some looked ordinary at first, but the more I inspected, the more deliberate the arrangement seemed. A branch bent at an impossible angle, a stone smoothed into a small mound. Tiny depressions in the dirt suggested more than footsteps. They suggested kneeling, crawling, fighting. Someone had been here and they hadn't left willingly. I crouched, running a hand over the soil. It was soft, damp, and cold, yet something about it made my skin crawl. A faint smell rose, earthy, iron-tinged, almost like rusted blood. I gagged lightly, stepping back. That smell wasn't from long ago. It lingered, persistent, as if the clearing itself remembered. I realized then that the clearing wasn't empty. It was hollowed by memory. A rustle to my right. My head snapped in that direction. A shadow shifted between two trees, too fast, too deliberate. I froze, heart hammering, eyes straining. There was nothing, just the sway of branches, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. The shadows here moved differently, obeyed some rhythm that wasn't natural. And then I heard it, a faint whisper just on the edge of hearing. Words I couldn't understand, syllables that rolled like smoke through the air. I held my breath, trying to catch a clue, anything. The whisper stopped abruptly, leaving a ringing in my ears. I edged further into the clearing, keeping my flashlight low, careful. The ground felt uneven, but the bumps and depressions weren't random. Some were almost like shapes, small mounds like crouched figures pressed to the earth. I kicked at one lightly with my boot. The dirt scattered, revealing a tangle of roots, mud, and a butt. Small, metal, slightly rusted, with a tiny engraved swirl I recognized from jackets I'd seen abandoned in the forest before. My stomach sank. The forest had a history, and these fragments were pieces of it. I looked around, and the sense of unease deepened. The clearing wasn't just a place. It was a shrine, a trap, a memory frozen in time. Something about it was wrong in a way I couldn't name, a quiet violence that pressed into my mind. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but a grim curiosity pushed me forward. Near the center, I spotted a small, hollowed depression in the dirt. Not natural, almost like a shallow pit. The edges were smooth, pressed down. I crouched and looked inside. Nothing. Just soil, leaves, and the faint outline of what had once been. I ran a finger along the edge. The soil gave under my touch, and I thought I saw something beneath, disturbed earth, as though someone had struggled to escape. My pulse jumped. I recoiled, scanning the clearing. Something felt alive here, watching, shifting in the corners of my vision. The whispers returned, fainter now, almost playful, sliding between the trees. My hair stood on end. I tried to speak, to call out, but my voice caught. The words seemed to die before leaving my lips. I took a step back, tripped over a root, and landed hard. Pain shot through my shoulder, but worse was the sound, a hollow echo, like the clearing had swallowed it and laughed. The whispers grew sharper, almost synchronized with my heartbeat, inhuman in their rhythm. I forced myself up and back toward the edge, trying to stay calm, trying to reason. Maybe it was the wind, the shifting branches, my mind playing tricks after everything I'd seen. But I knew better. The clearing had its own presence, and it wasn't neutral. It knew I was here. I could feel it pressing at the edges of my consciousness, nudging, testing, reminding me of all who had come before. A sudden shift, a shadow in the corner, too tall to be human, too slender to be a tree. I froze, chest tightening. It vanished when I blinked. My mind tried to rationalize. Perhaps sunlight through leaves, a trick of perspective. But my gut refused. Something or someone had been watching me. I could almost feel its breath in the cold air, almost feel its eyes tracking every move. I edged closer to the depression at the center, curiosity overriding fear. The soil here was different, more compact, unnaturally so. And then I noticed it, faint impressions like hands pressed into the earth, small, desperate. Someone had knelt here. Someone had clawed at the dirt trying to drag themselves out. My hands shook as I traced the shapes. Each one told a story of panic, of fear, of surrender. I swallowed the rising bile in my throat. I stumbled backward, bumping into a tree. The bark scratched my palms. Shadows danced along its surface. And then I saw the faintest flicker, movement, not in the trees but in the clearing itself. Tiny, almost imperceptible. A crouching figure, motionless, then gone. I blinked, heart hammering. Was it real, or was my mind finally cracking under the forest's weight? I couldn't tell, and that uncertainty was worse than any sighting. The whispers returned, surrounding me now, coming from multiple directions. Words, or what I thought were words, pushed at the edges of my comprehension. Run, don't stay. You will not leave. I could feel the clearing tightening around me, the trees leaning closer, shadows stretching toward me. The ground beneath my feet seemed to pulse, subtly, as if the forest itself were breathing. I tried to leave, but the clearing shifted. Paths I thought I had memorized now twisted back on themselves. Every step forward brought me to another section I'd passed before. The shadows at the edges shifted just slightly, guiding me, nudging me deeper. I realized then the forest wasn't just a place. It was a labyrinth, alive with memory and intent. A faint glint caught my eye near the hollow. I crouched, reaching for it. A fragment of a ring, bent, scratched. I picked it up, cold metal against my palm. I imagined the hands that had worn it, the person who had vanished here. The weight of it pressed on me, not physically but emotionally. The clearing wasn't just hollow. It was filled with echoes. Echoes of struggle, whispers of panic, remnants of those who had failed to escape. I moved slowly, scanning the edges, trying to understand the pattern, the rhythm. And then I saw it, marks in the moss leading toward a denser thicket. Small depressions, shallow, like someone had crawled on hands and knees. I followed them. Each step was measured, careful, my own presence muffled against the earth. The deeper I went, the more the whispers sharpened, almost urgent, almost pleading. You shouldn't be here. You can't leave. The clearing widened again, but this time the center was empty. The hollow pit was gone or hidden. I knelt, brushing aside leaves, only to find another set of impressions. This time footprints, small, human, leading in circles. The forest seemed to play with me, showing me pieces, hiding others. I realized then that no one left the clearing as they entered. The ground itself was the witness, the forest the predator. A movement at the edge of my vision. I turned quickly. A figure, indistinct, half-shadow, crouched behind a fallen log, and then gone. I swallowed the fear rising in my chest. Each glimpse, each whisper, each shadow pulled me deeper into the story of this place. I was no longer just a visitor. I was becoming part of it, a character in the forest's ongoing narrative of struggle, panic, and disappearance. I stumbled backward, trying to retrace my steps, to leave the hollowed clearing behind. But each path twisted unexpectedly, and the shadows seemed to anticipate my moves. The whispers intensified, circling, almost chanting. I felt myself shrinking inside, my confidence eroding. The clearing had consumed others, and it seemed ready to consume me too. I stopped, panting, hands on knees. The forest was silent for a heartbeat. Then, just behind me, the faintest sigh. Or was it a whisper, a breath? Stay, watch, remember. I froze, my mind raced. Every warning I'd read in the notes, every fragment I'd found along the trail, every broken item in the mud, they led here to this hollow, to this pulse of memory and fear. And now it wanted me to see it fully. I looked around, taking in the clearing in one long, shivering sweep. Flattened moss, twisted branches, the hollow pit, the scattered items. The shadows clung to the edges, trembling, shifting. The whispers came in waves now, impossible to follow completely, half words, half sounds. I realized with a sinking heart that the forest wasn't done with me. Not yet. I took a deep breath and moved toward the edge of the clearing. Every step felt deliberate, every breath heavy. I didn't know if I would leave this place as I entered. The signs of struggle had become my own. Woven into the story, the forest was writing with me. And as I stepped back into the thicket, the whispers followed, not fading, not ending, echoing long after I could see the clearing again. The footprints appeared before I even realized I was looking for them. Mud pressed into the forest floor, shallow, irregular, like someone or something had walked here yesterday. My boots sank slightly as I approached, and I noticed their edges were crisp, almost fresh, despite the rain that had fallen last night. My pulse picked up. I'd walked this path before, alone, retracing old trails, and I knew these prints weren't mine. I crouched, fingertips hovering above the soft earth. They were small, narrow, but deliberate. They led forward in a straight line, but then, something impossible, the trail stopped abruptly. The forest floor was smooth beyond that point, unbroken, as if the footprints had evaporated into the air. I froze. A part of me wanted to laugh at my own paranoia. A louder, darker part whispered that I wasn't alone, that whatever made these prints was still here, watching. I took a cautious step forward, scanning the undergrowth. The woods were silent except for the faint drip of water from the leaves, but it wasn't normal silence. There was a pressure in it, like the world was holding its breath. My flashlight trembled in my hand. Shadows clung unnaturally to the tree trunks, stretching toward me at odd angles. The prints had led me here for a reason, but what reason? I followed the line in reverse, trying to make sense of it. The footprints reappeared a few yards back, leading into a dense thicket. I pushed through, branches scratching at my jacket, thorns biting my hands. The smell changed here, earthy at first, but now sharper, metallic, faintly coppery. I gagged and covered my nose. I wanted to believe it was just mud and rain, but the scent carried the weight of something far older, something unwilling to be ignored. I paused, the air shifted. A faint rustle above me. Leaves fluttered down, but I caught the glint of movement, just for a second, a flash of white in the canopy. I blinked. Nothing. My chest tightened. I could feel it then, that same sensation I'd felt in the hollowed clearing, being observed. Not by eyes I could see, but by presence. Something in these woods was aware of me, and it wasn't human. The trail started again, leading toward a small rise. Each footprint was pressed deeper now, more distinct, as if whoever or whatever was moving with intent, heavier, deliberate. I leaned closer, tracing the edges with my fingers. Something about the rhythm of the prints felt wrong. They didn't stride like a person. They hesitated, staggered, then moved with sudden certainty. Fear coiled in my stomach. Whoever had walked here, they were playing with me or warning me. I followed them uphill, light dimming under the thick canopy. And then I saw it, a clearing, small, hidden, almost perfectly circular. The footprint stopped at its edge. I swept my flashlight across the dirt. Nothing. No impression of continuation. It was like the trail had simply vanished into the earth. My voice caught as I whispered to myself, how could someone just disappear? A branch snapped behind me. My head whipped around. Nothing. I pressed my back against a tree, trying to catch my breath, trying to calm the rising panic. The forest had become oppressive, the shadows thick, almost tangible. The clearing itself seemed to pulse faintly with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. I took a step forward and the whisper came. Soft at first, then growing, a susurration threading through the branches. Don't follow. You can't leave. I shook my head, telling myself I was imagining it. I had to keep moving. I had to know. I moved into the clearing, scanning every inch. And then I saw them, disturbances in the soil, subtle, almost invisible at first. Tiny depressions forming a circle like someone had knelt there, rotating, touching the earth. I knelt to inspect them. Fingers brushing the soil, and I thought I felt a vibration, faint but real, a pulse beneath my fingertips. I pulled back sharply. The shadows at the edge of the clearing shifted. I thought I glimpsed figures crouched there, low to the ground, retreating when I blinked. My throat went dry. The forest had a rhythm I couldn't understand, a pulse older than anything I'd ever known. Every broken twig, every disturbed leaf, every vanished footprint was a message, but I didn't know the language. A sudden breeze stirred and I heard it, a voice, a sigh. I froze, listening. It came from the far edge of the clearing, soft, human-like but hollow. Here, I didn't respond. My flashlight quivered, and in its beam a faint glimmer, a small object half buried in the dirt. I crouched and picked it up. A fragment of a bracelet, broken, scratched with tiny marks. I remembered seeing similar items along the trail. Each one was a breadcrumb, a story of someone who had vanished, leaving only traces. I stood clutching the bracelet, and the whispers intensified, swirling in every direction. They were no longer faint. They echoed across the clearing, almost chanting, but in a language I couldn't understand. My legs shook. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run, but the path back was distorted, like the forest itself was shifting. Every tree seemed to loom closer, every shadow leaning toward me. The footprints had led me here, and now the clearing wanted something from me. I noticed the ground near the object. Another footprint, partially obscured by moss, leading away, then disappearing. Like the others, it ended in nothing. I knelt, staring at it, heart hammering. Whoever had walked here hadn't just vanished. They had been erased, consumed, or led elsewhere. I felt a creeping panic, realizing that I might be next. The forest wasn't just hiding secrets. It was hungry for them. I stepped toward the edge, trying to find a familiar trail. The whispering followed, now layered, coming from everywhere and nowhere. I saw movement in the corner of my eye, tiny flashes of white, shapes crouched low, vanishing when I looked directly. My mind reeled. The clearing wasn't just a place. It was a stage, and I was in the center, the protagonist in a story older than me. I tried to leave again, but the footprints reappeared sporadically, not in a straight line, not in a pattern I could follow. Each one ended abruptly, as though the forest itself had swallowed them. I realized then that no path here was real. No exit was guaranteed. The clearing was a trap, or a test, or something far worse. A faint sound carried through the trees, a whispering footstep, light, deliberate. I froze, straining to hear. My flashlight caught a glimpse of motion between two trunks. I blinked and it was gone. But the clearing seemed to pulse in response, the soil beneath my boots slightly vibrating. I pressed my palms to the earth and I could feel it, an energy subtle but undeniable. The forest had remembered every struggle, every disappearance, every fear, and now it was aware of me. The sky overhead darkened subtly, as if the canopy itself thickened. I shivered, brushing at sweat and fear. The bracelet in my hand was heavier now, loaded with the weight of countless vanished hikers. I tried to focus, tried to remember my training, my logic, but each step into the clearing dragged me further into unease, into that ancient rhythm of whispers, vanished footprints, and shadows that moved just beyond comprehension. I realized then what the forest wanted. Not my body, not my life, not yet. It wanted acknowledgement. It wanted me to see, to witness the pattern, to understand that the vanishing was deliberate, that the forest was older and more patient than I could ever be. Every footprint, every trace, every echo was proof that someone, or something, still roamed here unseen, waiting. I backed toward the edge, careful, slow. My flashlight caught another footprint, small, human, leading into a thicket, and like the others it disappeared, vanished. No trail, no sign, nothing but soil pressed flat as if it had never existed. My stomach twisted. I realized then that leaving might be impossible, that the forest, this clearing, had a hold not just on the land but on memory, on perception. I paused, chest heaving. The whispers softened, almost coaxing. My eyes swept the clearing one last time, the disturbed soil, the vanished footprints, the faint glimmer of a bracelet half buried in mud. Each fragment was a story I could not finish, a life erased. And as I turned to finally leave, I felt a presence brush past me, subtle, deliberate, like someone walking just behind my shoulder. I dared not look. The trail back through the forest was distorted, twisted by shadows and memory. I could hear faint rustling behind me, but when I glanced over my shoulder, nothing moved. The footprints I had been following were gone, yet the sense of someone or something following persisted. I knew then, without doubt, that I was not alone, that the forest still held the echoes of the vanished, that the footprints that vanish are never truly gone. And as I stumbled onward, heart hammering, I knew I would return to that clearing in my dreams. I would see those footprints again, suspended in the soil, leading to nowhere, whispering of the unseen, reminding me that in these woods the missing are never truly gone, and the forest never forgets. The wind picked up before I even noticed it. At first it was just a chill threading through the trees, brushing my neck, tugging at my jacket. But then it changed. It carried words, soft, almost unintelligible, but there. I stopped in the middle of the trail, every hair on my arm standing on end. Come, follow, leave. I couldn't tell if it was warning me or mocking me. I swallowed, my mouth dry, and tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. Forests are full of sound, I told myself. Branches snap, leaves rustle, birds chatter. But this was different. The words twisted and bent with the wind, echoing around me from every direction. I could feel the air pressing against my chest, urging me to listen, to obey. A branch scraped my shoulder, sharp, abrupt. I spun, flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. Nothing. The trail ahead was empty, but the whispering persisted. It wasn't just the wind, it was deliberate. Each gust seemed to form a syllable, each pause a question. I shivered and pressed on, trying to convince myself I was only hearing echoes of old fears. The trees thinned, giving way to a small rise. I realized the clearing from before was behind me now, shrouded in shadow. I glanced back, half expecting to see movement, but it was still. Silent. Too silent. The wind swirled around me, carrying hints of scent, damp earth, crushed leaves, something faintly metallic. My stomach knotted. It reminded me of footprints that vanish, of bracelets in the mud, of those who walked here and never returned. A gust hit my face, sharp and cold, and I heard it clearly this time. Not alone. My heart skipped. I spun in a circle, but the forest seemed empty, as if holding its breath. But the wind didn't stop. It threaded through the trees, curling around trunks, sliding across the ground. I could almost see it move, twisting in patterns, teasing my vision, shaping shadows that weren't real. Or maybe they were. I pressed forward, every step careful enough not to disturb the forest's rhythm. Every snap of twig, every whisper of my boots against the earth felt amplified. And then I heard it again. Look here, the words floated, fragmented, as if carried from different directions at once. My flashlight caught a flicker, a shape at the edge of the trees. I blinked. Nothing, but the sense of being watched tightened around my chest. I stopped, listened. The wind carried more words now, faster, insistent. See, remember, leave. My mind struggled to interpret them. They weren't threats. Not exactly. More like instructions, warnings, riddles wrapped in air. Every gust felt alive, purposeful, as though the forest itself had taken on a voice, one older and more patient than any humans. I remembered the footprints, the vanished trails, the hollowed clearing, the bracelet. All signs pointed here. And now the wind was guiding me, or luring me. I swallowed hard and followed a subtle dip in the ground where the earth seemed pressed down, almost forming a path. The words swirled with me, teasing, coaxing, carrying a rhythm I couldn't resist. The trail led me deeper into the forest, and the whispering became a low hum, almost melodic. I could hear syllables forming into fragments I almost understood. They never gone, wait. A sudden draft grazed my ear, almost like a breath, and I jerked my head. The forest was alive in a way I hadn't felt before. It wasn't just the wind, it was memory, pain, fear, and I was stepping into it. I stopped by a fallen tree, roots exposed, earth heaving like it had breathed recently. The wind twisted around me, carrying a faint, sorrowful tone. I crouched, pressing my palms against the roots, and thought I felt it. Subtle vibrations under my fingers like a heartbeat. A pulse from the forest itself, echoing footsteps that had vanished, breaths that had been silenced. A sudden rustle behind me. I whipped around, but only leaves fluttered down. Still, I could feel it, attention, focus, presence. The wind hummed low now, words threading together into something almost coherent. See them, follow the pattern, they wait. I realized with a chill that it wasn't just the wind talking. It was the forest speaking through the wind, carrying the echoes of every missing hiker, every vanishing footprint. I pressed on. The trail grew uneven, roots clawing at my boots, the soil damp and shifting. I noticed subtle signs, earth pressed down, leaves disturbed, a bracelet half buried again. Every detail tugged at memory, at dread. Each small discovery was a thread connecting the wind to the vanished, a bridge between the living and those who had disappeared. The wind grew stronger, circling me now, as if testing me, coaxing me to move faster, slower, in patterns I couldn't understand. Shadows shifted in response, long and unnatural, stretching toward me then retreating. I thought I glimpsed figures among the trees, human shapes crouched low, watching. But when I focused, they were gone. The forest was playing tricks, teasing my perception, blending past and present. I tried to find calm, reminding myself of logic, of reason. Yet every step, every sound reinforced the impossible. Footprints that led nowhere, whispers that spoke in riddles, shadows that vanished when I looked directly. And above all, the wind, alive, deliberate, patient, haunting. It carried the forest's memory, its fear, its hunger, and I was in the middle of it. I stopped by a slight depression in the ground, the earth damp, almost sculpted. Another bracelet, scratched, bent, broken. I picked it up, cold, heavy. It carried the weight of stories I would never fully know. The wind shifted around me, carrying the echo of laughter, cries, whispers, footsteps. And for a moment I realized the wind was never just wind. It was warning me, guiding me, revealing what the forest refused to forget. I took a step back, scanning the trees. The whispers softened, almost coaxing, almost human. Remember, don't forget. A branch scraped my shoulder. I whirled, expecting to see someone, but the forest held only shadows, leaves, the hum of wind speaking secrets. My heart raced. I knew then that leaving would be impossible unless I acknowledged it. Unless I understood that the forest itself was alive, and that it had its own way of telling stories, through vanished footprints, lost belongings, and a wind that talks. I moved forward cautiously, following a faint hollow in the undergrowth, feeling my way as much as seeing. Each step seemed to stir the air, and the wind responded, whispering faster now. See, follow, they wait. The words were less clear, but urgency threaded them. I felt small, exposed, like a child wandering in a memory older than time, a memory the forest had chosen to repeat over and over. Then the trail opened slightly, revealing a rise, trees arching above like cathedral columns. The wind pressed through, stronger, colder, carrying voices I could almost recognize. They were layered, men, women, children, all whispering, murmuring in the space between rustle and shadow. I realized with dread that these were the echoes of the vanished. Each disappearance was not forgotten, each story not ended, and now I was hearing them. I pressed my hand against the trunk of a massive oak, roots knotted and damp. The wind whipped around me, carrying a voice so faint I almost missed it. Stay or go, I swallowed. I had no answers, only the feeling of being part of something far older, something patient, something that did not forgive or forget. The forest's stories were alive, and I was in the middle of them. A final gust cut through the trees, sharp and sudden. Leaves swirled like birds, shadows danced and twisted, and the whispers converged, almost chanting in unison. They are not gone. We remember. We wait. I staggered, clutching the bracelet in my hand, feeling the weight of countless lost lives. The wind carried their fear, their hope, their warning. I stumbled onward, every step heavy, aware of every sound, every movement. The forest around me was alive in a way I could never explain. Footprints had vanished. Trails led to nothing. Yet the wind told me everything. And I knew with a certainty I could not shake that leaving these woods meant carrying their stories with me. That even in silence, even when the trail vanished, even when the shadows fled my gaze, the forest and the wind that talks would never let me forget. And as night fell, the whispers faded to a hum, a lullaby of danger and memory. I pressed on, guided by the invisible threads of air, footsteps, and stories that refused to die. Somewhere ahead, the forest waited, patient, ancient, and knowing. And I realized the wind had one final truth. It didn't just carry sound, it carried warning. And the forest, through its voice, was watching. The fog was thick that night, crawling between the trees like it had a life of its own. Every step I took felt muffled, swallowed by a gray silence. Then I saw it, a lantern flickering far ahead. A small, hesitant light, swaying as though carried by an invisible hand. My heart thumped harder. I wasn't supposed to be here, not alone, but the light drew me in and I couldn't look away. Locals had warned me. Stories about this forest, about the path I walked, about people who chased curiosity too far. They said a lantern appears sometimes, flickering in the mist, guiding or trapping the foolish. They didn't say what happened to those who followed it. Only that it had been tied to murders decades ago. I felt the weight of that warning now pressing against my chest, but curiosity always wins. Always. I stepped carefully, branches scraping my arms, leaves clinging to my shoes. The fog shifted, swirling around me. And then I realized the light wasn't moving toward me, it was moving away. Or maybe I was moving too fast. My mind scrambled to make sense of it. The lantern bobbed as if walking, not floating. There was a rhythm to it, slow and deliberate, like it knew I was watching. I thought about turning back, retracing my steps, but every instinct screamed at me to follow. I wanted to see, to understand. Each step forward tightened the fog around me, but also sharpened my focus. Shapes danced in the corner of my vision, trees, shadows, something I couldn't quite name. Every rustle, every distant crack of a branch set my nerves on edge. I was alone, but the forest didn't feel empty. A gust of wind rattled the trees, and I almost missed it. A faint voice, just beyond comprehension, weaving through the mist. "Don't," it whispered. My heart jumped. I spun around, flashlight trembling in my hands. Nothing but fog, thick and unyielding. The voice didn't come again, but the sensation lingered, a brush against my awareness. I wasn't imagining it. I knew I was. The lantern bobbed again. I tried to measure the distance, but the fog played tricks, stretching space, hiding landmarks. Each step forward felt like moving through water, slow and resistant. My shoes sank into damp earth. The smell of wet leaves and moss filled my nose. But underneath, something else lingered, a sharp tang, metallic like old blood. My stomach twisted. I stopped, held my breath. Nothing moved, nothing walked beside me, and yet I wasn't alone. Then I saw it clearly. A figure, thin, hunched, moving along with the lantern. Not human, not fully. Or maybe human once, long ago. I blinked and the figure shifted with the mist, almost invisible, a shadow within shadows. I wanted to run, but my legs refused. Fear held me in place, mingled with curiosity, drawing me forward at the same time. The path curved, revealing a small hollow. The lantern floated at the edge, swaying more violently now, as if impatient. My heart raced, and then I saw the ground, marks, deep impressions in the mud, like someone had struggled, fallen, dragged. I swallowed. Every warning I'd ignored came rushing back. The locals had said this place remembers. The forest remembers. And now it was showing me. I stepped closer, boots sinking into wet earth. The lantern swayed, light spilling onto the marks. They weren't fresh, but the pattern was unmistakable. A struggle, someone resisting. My pulse pounded in my ears. Something told me to leave, to step back and run toward safety. But the fog pressed in, obscuring the way I'd come. It wasn't an option anymore. Not yet. The figure moved again, just at the edge of vision, closer now, but not entirely there. The fog wrapped around it like a veil. My chest tightened. I could feel its gaze even though I couldn't see its eyes. And then the lantern flickered violently, almost like it was breathing. My mind tried to rationalize. Maybe a trapped animal, maybe my eyes playing tricks. But the smell, the coppery hint of old blood, refused to lie. I crouched, tracing a line in the mud, following the impressions. They led nowhere, or they led everywhere at once. Each footprint seemed to vanish into the fog, swallowed by mist, as if the forest itself erased them. I felt a wave of nausea. The air felt alive, shifting around me, and I realized I wasn't moving forward. I was moving deeper into memory, into the remnants of past horrors. A sudden rustle behind me. I whipped around, flashlight beams slicing through the gray. Nothing, only fog, but the wind shifted. A faint whisper threaded through the trees, clearer now. "Follow or stay." My throat tightened. I wanted to answer, to argue with it, to demand sense. But the voice wasn't human, not anymore. And in that moment I understood I was not alone, never alone in this forest. The lantern hovered closer, illuminating a patch of earth where a tree had been struck down long ago. Broken branches, scratched bark, earth disturbed as if a struggle had passed through. My stomach turned. I recognized the signs. Someone, something had fought here, had suffered. And the forest, patient and unyielding, had held the memory. The wind whispered through leaves, carrying fragments of a story I would never fully understand. I wanted to step back, to run, to scream. But the lantern pulsed, beckoning, impatient. I felt compelled to follow, each step heavy, reluctant. The fog swirled, revealing shapes, almost people, almost shadows, lingering just beyond the light. Faces I couldn't quite see, expressions twisted in fear, resignation, warning. My chest burned. I realized the forest was alive with memory, replaying what had happened, forcing me to witness it. The lantern stopped at a small hollow, roots and branches twisted like claws. The wind whispered again, sharper, more urgent. "Do not look." Yet see, I froze, unable to move. The fog seemed to tighten, pressing against my skin. My mind raced, connecting the lantern, the hollow, the whispers, the vanished trails I had read about. The forest didn't just hide danger, it preserved it, replayed it, demanded acknowledgement. A sudden gust whipped past me, carrying the scent of something old, something decayed. The lantern flared brightly for a heartbeat, then dimmed, revealing the hollow in full. Mud, broken branches, and an object half buried, a rusted knife. My stomach lurched. I reached for it, gloves brushing metal, cold and heavy. Blood, old and dried, stained the handle. I staggered back. The lantern flickered again, almost impatiently. The forest was showing me its story. I realized then the fog and the lantern, the whispers and the hollow, they were all connected. Every disappearance, every warning, every cautionary tale the locals had whispered, it all converged here. The forest didn't forgive curiosity. It didn't let you leave unmarked. And yet, I was still drawn forward, compelled to see more, understand more, even as every instinct screamed to flee. The wind shifted again, soft, coaxing, almost gentle. "Do not leave yet." The lantern pulsed once more, then floated slowly toward the shadows, deeper into the mist. I had no choice but to follow, each step echoing in the fog, boots sinking into wet earth. The whispers rose again, almost voices now, faint but clear. "They wait, we remember." My chest burned with dread. I was walking among memory, among echoes of fear that refused to die. And then the forest seemed to exhale, a deep, sighing breath that rattled the trees. I realized I could never fully escape this place. The lantern, the mist, the wind, they were all threads in a story I had stumbled into, one that had begun long before me, one that would continue long after I left. And as I followed the light deeper into shadow, deeper into memory, I understood. The forest never forgets. It doesn't forgive. And the lantern waits for the next curious soul. I found myself standing before a house no one spoke about anymore. The paint had peeled in long, jagged strips, the windows gaping black, empty like hollow eyes. A loose shingle rattled in the wind, or maybe it was something else, something alive. The locals never mentioned this place, not aloud. Maybe because they knew, maybe because they were afraid to remember. I'd come looking for answers, but already I felt the weight of 100 unsaid warnings pressing down on me. The air smelled of damp wood and decay. Each step on the broken porch groaned beneath my weight, as if the house itself resented my intrusion. I touched the door frame, rough splinters cutting my fingers, and shivered. This place wasn't just abandoned. It had been left in a hurry, or perhaps something had been left behind. Inside, the air was colder, heavier. Dust floated like frozen motes of light, disturbed by my movement. Shadows clung to the corners, deeper than the night outside. I noticed the furniture first, tipped over chairs, a table scarred with scratches and stains that seemed far too deliberate to be random. Something had happened here, and the house hadn't forgotten. I followed the narrow hallway, the wooden floor creaking under each step, each sound amplified in the oppressive silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone, or something, was watching from the shadows. A photograph on the wall caught my eye, black and white, edges curled. A family posed stiffly, smiles thin and strained. But one face had been scratched out, obliterated by some desperate hand. I felt my stomach tighten. The absence screamed more loudly than the presence ever could. I moved deeper into the house, drawn toward a small room at the back. The floor was littered with old belongings, shoes, a broken toy, letters yellowed and brittle. I picked one up, feeling the fragile paper crumble in my fingers. The handwriting was rushed, desperate, almost pleading. I couldn't read it all, but fragments stuck with me. "Gone, don't look. They watch." My pulse quickened. Whoever had written this had been terrified, trapped. And now I felt the same. A window rattled in the corner, though the air was still. I jumped. My flashlight trembled in my hand. I told myself it was the wind or a loose pane, but deep down I knew better. The house had ears, eyes, memory. It remembered the fear, the struggles, the people who had vanished without explanation. I left the house reluctantly, stepping into the gray light of the afternoon. The cemetery nearby called to me, rows of unkempt stones hidden beneath tangled vines. Each marker told a story, though most had been forgotten. Names, dates, sometimes just a crude carving on a rough slab of stone. I wandered among them, noticing a pattern, clusters of disappearances, graves dated decades apart, all tied to the same stretch of forest. Each life that had vanished had left a trace, however faint, and now the forest, the house, the stones, they all whispered the same warning: remember us. One grave in particular drew me close. The name had almost faded entirely. I traced it with my finger: Evelyn Harrow, died or disappeared 1963. The earth around the grave was disturbed, uneven, as if something had been recently unearthed or moved. I crouched, brushing away leaves. Footprints led up to the marker and stopped abruptly, as though the person had vanished into thin air. My heart pounded. Someone or something had returned here recently. I felt a shift in the air, subtle but undeniable. The fog rolled in, low and creeping, threading between the stones. A whisper floated through it, soft, almost a sigh. "Don't leave," I froze, scanning the cemetery. Shadows clung to the trees, flickering with the movement of the fog. I wanted to call out, to ask what had happened here, but my voice caught in my throat. The stories weren't meant to be spoken aloud. They were meant to haunt, to warn, to linger. I traced a path between the graves, each step uncovering more signs. Broken branches, scuffed earth, a glove with a finger torn off. I recognized the pattern now. The same subtle signs I'd noticed in the forest, in abandoned homes, in the hollowed paths. Someone had fought, resisted, struggled. And the forest, the houses, the stones, they had kept the memory alive. My stomach twisted. I had stumbled into a web of past tragedies, each thread vibrating with residual fear. The wind shifted again, carrying a faint murmur, almost like words caught on the edge of hearing. I tilted my head, trying to listen, trying to understand. It wasn't coherent, but it was persistent. Follow, remember, beware. I shivered. I didn't know whether it was the wind or something more. But I did know one thing: the forest and its forgotten victims weren't done with me yet. I spotted another set of disturbed earth near the edge of the cemetery. Footprints, smaller this time, weaving between the stones and disappearing into the mist beyond. I knelt, tracing them with a trembling hand. They didn't make sense. They led nowhere, yet carried the weight of intent, of urgency. My mind raced. Someone had been here recently, and yet there was no sound, no sign of their passage beyond these fleeting traces. A branch snapped behind me. I spun, flashlight cutting a sharp line through the fog. Nothing, but the sense of being watched tight. The cemetery had shifted in tone, the air heavier, thicker. The stories the locals whispered, the disappearances, the murders, the vanished, they weren't just stories. They were warnings, layered and alive. And now I understood. The forest and its outskirts, the abandoned houses, the forgotten graves, they weren't safe to witness. Not fully. I pressed forward, toward the deeper edge of the cemetery, where stones leaned crazily and the earth fell away into shadow. I noticed markings I hadn't before, carved into tree trunks, rough scratches almost invisible in the dim light. Symbols I didn't recognize, but their intent was clear. Leave or suffer. My chest ached. My mind screamed, but something kept me moving. Curiosity, morbid and consuming, propelled me. A sudden gust of wind rolled through the cemetery, swirling leaves and fog around me. And for the first time I felt a presence close, deliberate, aware of me. The air shifted, carrying a faint smell, coppery, sharp, old blood. My stomach turned. I looked around, but there was nothing. Only shadows, stretching, twisting, hinting at shapes that weren't there. Shapes that once had been. I stumbled upon another grave, smaller, almost hidden beneath a fallen tree. The marker was unmarked, simple, crude. But the earth had been recently turned. I knelt again. My fingers brushed something cold, a small, worn trinket, a pendant with a cracked photograph inside. The face was blurred, but I recognized the terror in the eyes. I had seen it before, in the margins of old reports, whispered in fearful tones. The forgotten victim. And now, The forest had placed them here for me to find, to see. I straightened, heart hammering. A low whisper closer now threaded through the fog. Do not forget, I spun. Shadows rippled across the gravestones. For a moment I thought I saw movement, a figure watching, patient. Then it vanished. The lantern from the forest flickered in the distance, back beyond the trees, a faint pulse of light. My pulse quickened. I had come seeking answers, but all I had found were fragments, hints, warnings. The past was alive here, and it had a voice. I realized then the truth. These homes, these graves, the forest itself, they were linked. Every disappearance, every tragedy, every scream buried in memory, they were threads of the same dark tapestry, and I, standing among them, was entangled now. Every warning, every mark, every whisper confirmed it. The forgotten victims were not gone. They lingered, carried by wind, earth, fog, waiting for someone to remember. I turned to leave, retracing my steps, but the cemetery had changed. Paths I had walked were gone, replaced by twisting roots and shadowed hollows. The fog thickened, pressing against my skin, closing in. Whispers rose again, fragmented but clear. Do not leave, do not forget. My stomach clenched. I understood finally that I would not simply walk away. The forest, the houses, the graves, they had claimed me in a small way. My memory now carried their echoes. And as I stumbled back toward the edge, toward the lantern that pulsed faintly through the mist, I realized something worse than fear: knowledge. I knew the pattern, the victims, the struggles, the vanished. I knew the forest remembered, and I would carry that knowledge, that terror, wherever I went, long after the mist swallowed me from sight. It appeared again the moment the fog swallowed the path ahead, a faint glow, flickering, suspended in the gray like a pulse. At first I thought it was a trick of my eyes, a reflection off wet leaves, or maybe the sun struggling to break through the mist. But the warmth it radiated, so subtle yet unmistakable, told me it wasn't natural. The locals had whispered about it in hushed tones, warnings hidden in old tale leaves. The lantern moves, they said. I never believed them. I thought they were trying to scare outsiders. Now, standing alone among the twisted trees and damp undergrowth, I wondered if belief had anything to do with it at all. I quickened my pace, trying to close the distance. The lantern swayed lightly, teasing, as if aware of my intent. Every step I took, it seemed to retreat just far enough to remain beyond reach. The path was uneven, slick with mud and roots that clawed at my boots, but my focus was fixed entirely on that flickering light. Part of me wanted to call out, to ask it why it moved, to demand an answer. Another part, deeper and quieter, told me to stop, to turn back, but I couldn't. Something about it felt urgent, compelling. A low rustle behind me made my heart jump. I spun, flashlight trembling in my hand. Nothing, just the fog and the skeletal outlines of trees. Yet I felt it then, a presence, patient, deliberate, hovering in the periphery of vision. The lantern flickered again, and I realized it wasn't just ahead of me. Sometimes, impossibly, it was behind me, reflected in the mist like a twin. My mind raced. Had I circled? Was I walking in a loop? Or was the lantern moving in ways my mind couldn't comprehend? Branches snapped to my right. I froze. My breath came shallow and fast, clouding in the cold air. The light ahead pulsed again, a heartbeat in the fog. I noticed something I hadn't before, a shadow, elongated and thin, flitting between the trees. Every time I blinked, it vanished, leaving only the lantern. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a deer, maybe another hiker, but nothing else in the forest felt so deliberate. The lantern had intent, and it had me in its orbit. I pressed on, navigating around fallen logs and tangled roots. Each step echoed through the fog, loud, intrusive, as though announcing my trespass. The light bobbed gently, sometimes advancing when I paused, sometimes retreating when I ran. And always it seemed to watch. I kept expecting the mist to part and reveal someone standing there, holding it. But every time I reached the spot, there was nothing, just fog, just shadows, just the pulse of a faint lantern glow. I thought about the stories I'd heard, travelers who vanished, houses where doors opened to empty rooms, whispers in the wind. None of it made sense. None of it should exist. And yet here I was, following something that wasn't supposed to be real, something that moved with a knowledge of me I didn't want it to have. My flashlight flickered. I tapped it, shook it, cursed the batteries, but the lantern's glow remained, untouched by my human tools. The path curved, and I stumbled onto a clearing I hadn't seen before. It was small, encircled by tall, leaning trees whose branches knitted together like skeletal fingers. The lantern floated in the center, swinging gently, as if tethered to something unseen. My gut twisted. The air felt denser here, heavier, saturated with the scent of wet leaves and something else, something metallic, coppery. I stepped forward, compelled despite the dread curling through me. A whisper came then, soft, a sibilant hiss that threaded through the fog. I froze. It wasn't the wind. It carried meaning, or at least it tried. Follow, it seemed to say. Do not stop. My throat was dry, words caught on the edge of panic. The lantern swayed, moving again, not away, not toward, but circling just beyond reach. It wasn't guiding me, it was taunting me, or teaching me. I couldn't tell which, and that uncertainty gnawed at the edges of my mind. I took another step, and the ground beneath me shifted unexpectedly. A depression, almost like a shallow grave, lay hidden beneath the fog and leaves. My foot brushed against something cold and hard. I knelt, fingers brushing away detritus. A small trinket, a pendant, cracked and tarnished, rested in the earth. The photograph inside was faint, blurred, but the expression on the face was unmistakable. Terror, wide-eyed, pleading. I recoiled, my stomach twisting. The lantern's glow seemed to pulse brighter, as if acknowledging my discovery. I stood, clutching the pendant. Every instinct screamed to leave, to run until the fog and trees swallowed me back into safety. But I couldn't. The lantern moved again, bobbing gently as if impatient. The whisper returned, closer this time, circling around me. Remember, I shivered, stepping backward, scanning the clearing. Shadows flickered at the edge of my vision, quick and silent. I realized with a cold certainty that I wasn't alone. Something had always been here, hidden in the fog, tethered to the lantern. I turned to run, and the lantern followed, floating effortlessly through the mist. Each step I took, it mirrored, dancing in the gray like a heartbeat just out of sync with mine. The forest behind me seemed to twist, trees bending impossibly, roots writhing in shadows. Every familiar path I had marked vanished. I was walking in circles, trapped by the lantern's subtle pull. The realization hit me like ice. It didn't want me to leave. Not yet. Not ever. A sudden rustle to my left made me pivot sharply. There, barely visible through the fog, a figure, thin, shadowed, featureless, stood watching. I blinked and it was gone. The lantern moved closer, or perhaps I had stepped closer. I couldn't tell anymore. My hands trembled, flashlight shaking violently. I whispered to myself, trying to ground reality. It's just a trick, just fog, just shadows. But the lantern laughed softly, a flicker in its glow that mimicked movement, almost sentient. I tried to leave the clearing, but the paths twisted unnaturally. Every familiar landmark had shifted or disappeared. The lantern moved ahead, then behind, then circling. It seemed to know my intentions before I did. And then I realized I had been followed for hours without noticing, led deeper into the forest, deeper into the fog. My pulse raced. My lungs burned. The fog thickened, clinging to skin and hair, hiding the ground beneath my boots. I could barely see the lantern now, only sense it. A presence, a heartbeat, a warning. I stumbled across a shallow stream, icy water seeping into my shoes. The lantern hovered over the far bank, inviting, mocking. I hesitated, then took a step forward. Another, and another. Each one felt heavier, as if the forest itself resisted my passage. The whispers intensified, layered now, multiple voices threading together. Do not stop. Do not leave, you belong. I wanted to scream, to shatter the fog with sound, but no voice would come. The lantern's glow flickered wildly, throwing long, dancing shadows. For a moment I thought I saw faces in them, dozens of eyes watching, distorted, fearful, angry. They vanished when I blinked. I pressed on, every nerve screaming, yet compelled. I didn't understand why. Maybe curiosity, maybe fear, maybe something older, deeper than reason. The forest had memory. The lantern had intent, and I was caught between both. I reached a small rise, and for the first time I saw beyond the fog. The trees thinned slightly, revealing the faint outline of a ruined cabin, blackened by time and weather. The lantern hovered there, motionless, waiting. I felt the tug again, soft, insistent. A thread connecting me to it. I wanted to leave, yet something stronger than will kept me moving forward. The pendant in my hand felt warm now, as though vibrating with life. I didn't know if it was real or the lantern influencing me. As I approached the cabin, the fog thickened once more. The lantern swung gently, then darted forward, vanishing behind the structure. I froze. Silence fell, unnatural and absolute. Not a sound of wind, not a single creak of wood, nothing but the faint hum of my own heartbeat. Then a soft glow reappeared behind me just beyond the fog. It had moved again, and I understood. I wasn't in control. The lantern guided, lured, perhaps judged. I realized then the truth, cold and certain. This wasn't a light to follow. It wasn't an invitation. It was a sentinel, a presence that lingered between the living and the forgotten. Its movement wasn't random. It was deliberate, patient, impossible to predict. And I was trapped in its orbit, my own curiosity sealing the circle. I turned back toward the mist, toward the familiar path, but it was gone, replaced by thick, choking fog. The lantern appeared ahead again, flickering, pulsing, waiting. And I understood with the clarity of terror that it would not let me go. Not until I understood its purpose, not until I remembered what it carried, not until I became part of its story. The wind shifted, leaves swirled, whispers threaded through the fog, soft, fragmented. Do not leave, do not forget, do not look away. I felt the forest closing in, alive, remembering, watching. And the lantern moved again, always just beyond reach, always guiding, always present. I realized I could never follow it fully, could never escape its pull. The fog would always shift, the forest would always twist, and the lantern would always move, leading, watching, waiting. There was no resolution, only the slow, insistent pull of curiosity and fear, threading through every step, every shadow, every heartbeat. And as I stood there, panting, pendant clutched in my hand, the lantern flickered once more, just for me, before it vanished into the gray. I knew it would return. I knew it would follow. And I knew that some part of me would always be left behind, wandering in the mist with it.